There is a specific kind of dread that comes not from a monster, but from a bureaucrat, not from a man who screams and rages, who commands attention with physical force or theatrical fury, but from a man who sits quietly at a desk, adjusts his pince-nez glasses, reviews a report, signs his name in neat, administrative handwriting, and moves on to the next document. The dread that radiates off that kind of man is different, colder, more total, because a man who screams eventually stops. A man who files paperwork does not. That is the problem at the center of this documentary. That is why, 80 years after the Second World War ended, historians are still arguing about exactly when Heinrich Himmler made certain decisions, what he knew when he knew it, and what the precise chain of command looked like between a chicken farm in Bavaria and the 6 million deaths he orchestrated. This is not a clean story. History rarely is. And the research into Himmler's life, the diaries, the speeches, the Nuremberg trial transcripts, the work of scholars like Richard Breitman and Peter Longerich reveals something deeply uncomfortable, that the man most responsible for industrializing mass murder was, by most outward measures, extraordinarily ordinary. He was born in Munich in 1900. He wanted to be a soldier. He studied agriculture. He failed at almost everything he tried before the age of 23. He kept a diary in which he recorded his thoughts on books, his opinions on religion, his feelings about girls he liked. His handwriting was neat. His grades were adequate. He wore glasses. He had stomach problems his entire life. And yet, within 3 decades of that unremarkable birth, he would command an organization numbering in the hundreds of thousands, a state within a state, and hold the bureaucratic authority to determine who lived and who died across an entire continent. This documentary is not an exercise in explaining away evil by invoking ordinary circumstance. We do not believe that evil is made more understandable by being made relatable, but we do believe that history is only useful when it is honest. And the honest truth about Himmler is that understanding how he became what he became matters more to the 21st century than simply cataloguing what he did, because what he did is documented. What made him remains a harder question, and it is that harder question that will carry us through these chapters. We will move through his childhood in pre-war Munich, through the catastrophic humiliation of Germany after the First World War, through the slow and deliberate construction of the SS, a force that began with fewer than 300 men and ended commanding more than 500,000 soldiers and operating the largest system of organized killing in human history. We will trace the architecture of that system, the bureaucracy, the offices, the titles, the deliberate legal ambiguities that allowed murder to be processed like administrative correspondence. We will look at the men around him, Heydrich, Ike, Huss, Pohl, and the moments at which the machine they built began to operate beyond even Himmler's full control. And we will end, as the war ended, with a man in a stolen uniform with a forged identity document, walking roads clogged with refugees, trying to disappear. He did not disappear. He was captured. He chose in the end the only exit he thought was still open to him. That ending, a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth, tells you something about the man. He planned for every contingency. He always had a backup system. Even in his final hour, the bureaucrat in him had made arrangements. This is going to take some time, so settle in. Before we begin, if you find this kind of deep dive historical documentary valuable, consider subscribing and sharing with someone who loves serious history. This channel exists because of your support, and we have many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Now, let us begin at the beginning. Chapter 1. A Quiet Boy from Munich. The Early Life of Heinrich Himmler, 1900 to 1923. Munich, in the autumn of 1900, was a city that believed in itself. Capital of Bavaria, seat of Ludwig II's architectural fantasies. home to breweries and universities, and a particular strain of conservative Catholic culture that had been building for centuries. It was, in short, precisely the kind of place where a middle-class schoolteacher might feel quietly confident that the world was ordered and comprehensible. Joseph Gebhard Himmler, teacher, former tutor to Bavarian royalty, a man of careful habits and social ambitions appropriate to his station, was that schoolteacher. On the 7th of October 1900, his second son was born. The boy was given the first name of his godfather, Prince Heinrich of Bavaria, and a surname that would one day carry more weight than either father or godfather could have imagined. The early years were, by every available account, thoroughly conventional. Heinrich grew up in a household that prized academic achievement, religious observance, and social respectability. The family moved to Landshut, roughly 40 kilometers northeast of Munich, when Heinrich was about 13, after his father took the position of assistant principal at the local gymnasium. He was a dutiful student, not brilliant, not struggling, dutiful. His teachers noted his conscientiousness. His classmates, in later interviews, remembered him as bookish and somewhat awkward, a boy who took notes carefully and did not particularly stand out on the athletic field. He kept a diary from the age of 10, and historians who have examined those early entries find the expected preoccupations of a patriotic Catholic boy in early 20th century Bavaria. Current events, religious reflections, discussions of dueling, and opinions on books he had read. What is notable, looking backward, is how ordinary all of it seems. The First World War shook that orderly world to pieces, not just for the Himmler family, but for an entire generation of German boys who had grown up being told that Germany was powerful, that the Kaiser's Germany was a modern empire, that the German army was the finest instrument of national strength in Europe. Heinrich was 15 when the war began. He was fervent, patriotic, desperate to serve. He watched his older brother Gebhard go to the Western Front, earn the Iron Cross, rise to the rank of lieutenant, and he burned with the need to do the same. Using his father's connections to the Bavarian royal household, Heinrich left school early and began officer candidate training with the reserve battalion of the 11th Bavarian Infantry Regiment in December of 1917. He was 17 years old. He had waited as long as he could bear. The armistice came on the 11th of November, 1918, while Himmler was still in training. He had not fired a shot. He had not seen the front. He had not earned any decoration, commanded any men, or experienced combat in any form. He was discharged on the 18th of December, 1918, and went home to Landshut. This is a moment that historians, particularly Longerich in his authoritative 2012 biography, identify as genuinely formative. Not the failure itself, which was shared by millions of young Germans, but Himmler's specific response to it. Not grief or resignation, but a hardening, an intensification. The boy who had been merely patriotic became something else. A young man with an unresolved score to settle with a world that had refused to let him prove himself on terms he understood. He finished his gymnasium education and enrolled at the Technische Hochschule München, what is now the Technical University of Munich, to study agriculture. He joined a German nationalist student fraternity. He began reading seriously and systematically in the literature of the radical right. The so-called Völkisch movement, which blended romantic German nationalism with biological racial theory in ways that had been circulating in Germany and Austria for decades. His diary during these years records a reading list dominated by anti-Semitic pamphlets, German mythology, and what his biographers describe as occult tracts. He was building a worldview from the wreckage of an expectation. The fact that this worldview was deeply, toxically anti-Semitic was not, at that moment in 1920, unusual on the radical right of the German political spectrum. What made it unusual was the systematic, almost academic way in which Himmler absorbed it. Other students read these pamphlets and put them down. Himmler filed them. He obtained his agricultural diploma in August of 1922. He wanted to continue to a doctorate. His family could not afford it. He took a low-paying office job in a manure processing factory in Schleißheim, near Munich. It would be tempting, and many popular accounts do not resist this temptation, to linger on the symbolic quality of that employment. We will note it once and move on, because what matters is not where he worked, but what he did after hours. He made contact with the National Socialists through SA chief Ernst Röhm, joined the Nazi Party in August of 1923, and was inside the movement within weeks of his enrollment. He would never leave it. He never wavered, not once, in the years that followed. That steadiness, that absolute lifelong political constancy, is itself a significant historical data point. Most people who join radical movements drift. Himmler calcified. On the 9th of November, 1923, he was in the street with Hitler, Röhm, Hermann Göring, and the others when the beer hall putsch collapsed. Against a line of Bavarian state police near the Feldherrnhalle in Munich, he was carrying a flag. He was not arrested. The evidence of his personal role was insufficient for a charge, but he lost his job, moved back in with his parents, and spent the following months unemployed and increasingly radicalized. The putsch had failed. Hitler was in prison, dictating Mein Kampf. The Nazi Party was technically banned. For anyone with practical options, this was the moment to exit. Himmler stayed. He took work as a party secretary and personal assistant to Gregor Strasser, whom Hitler had appointed Reich propaganda leader of the party in 1926. He traveled across Bavaria, giving speeches, distributing literature, organizing local party membership. He was not yet important. He was making himself indispensable. There is a difference, and Himmler understood it precisely. The speeches he gave in these years are revealing, not for their content, which was standard Nazi ideological product, but for their structure. He was methodical. He organized his arguments. He cited numbers. He categorized enemies. Where Hitler performed, Himmler catalogued. He told audiences about race consciousness, about the need for German expansion, about the eternal enemies of Germany, Jewish capital, Marxism in all its forms, liberal democracy, Slavic peoples. He also began, in this period, to exhibit a characteristic that would define his administrative career: an absolute, unceasing faith in the power of organization itself. Systems mattered to Himmler. Structures mattered. The right office with the right authority and the right procedures could accomplish what street fighting alone could not. He had been failed by a world that seemed to operate by incomprehensible rules. He would remake those rules into something comprehensible and control them. By 1927, he had been appointed deputy propaganda chief by Strasser, had told Hitler of his vision for transforming the SS into a racially pure elite force, and had been named Deputy Reichsführer SS, a position that at that moment commanded almost no one and meant almost nothing. The SS in 1927 was not an organization that attracted serious attention. It was a small, subordinate bodyguard unit within the larger SA, numbering a few hundred men. But Himmler saw what it could become. He had been 30 years of age. He married Marguerite Boden in 1928. They would have a daughter, Gudrun, in 1929. His domestic life was, by the accounts available, quiet, organized, correct. His professional life was accelerating towards something that no one in Bavaria, in that autumn of 1928, could quite see yet. The quiet boy from Munich was about to inherit a machine, and a machine, in the hands of a man who understands systems, is capable of almost anything. In January of 1929, the man who had been responsible for the SS, Erhard Heiden, resigned. Adolf Hitler, looking for a replacement, turned to his reliable, meticulous, utterly devoted deputy propaganda chief. Heinrich Himmler was appointed Reichsführer SS. At that moment, the SS numbered approximately 280 men. Within 4 years, it would number more than 52,000. The question historians have never fully resolved is whether Himmler arrived at his position with a fully formed plan, or whether the plan developed in response to opportunity. The answer, the evidence suggests, is both. And that combination of premeditated ambition and opportunistic agility is precisely what makes him one of the most consequential and most studied figures in the history of 20th century authoritarianism. Chapter 2: Building the Black Order. The SS under Himmler's hand, 1929 to 1933. When historians discuss the rise of the SS, there is a tendency in popular accounts to jump immediately to the black uniforms, the skulls on the collars, the theatrical intimidation of the organization's visual identity. That tendency misses something important. The visual language of the SS came later. What came first, what Himmler understood from almost his first day as Reichsführer SS, was the need for a principle of selection. Before you could have an elite, you needed to define what elite meant. Before you could have an organization that operated outside normal legal constraints, you needed to establish the philosophical basis on which that exceptionalism rested. Himmler spent the years between 1929 and 1933 building not just an organization, but an ideology of organizational identity. His first move was deceptively simple. He imposed strict membership criteria. The SS, he declared, would not take just anyone. Where the SA was broadly accessible, a mass movement, hundreds of thousands of men with varying levels of commitment and widely varying personal histories, the SS would be curated. Every applicant would be vetted for what Himmler called racial purity, meaning traceable German ancestry, physical standards reflecting what Nazi ideology described as Nordic characteristics, and a demonstrated record of political reliability. He described the selection process in terms borrowed directly from the agricultural training he had received at university. He was, quite literally, applying livestock breeding principles to human beings. In his own words, recorded in later speeches, he described the process as analogous to a nursery gardener trying to reproduce a good old strain that had been adulterated and debased. The language is instructive. He was not building a party. He was cultivating a lineage. The organization grew rapidly. From approximately 280 men in January of 1929, the SS expanded to roughly 3,000 by 1930, and to more than 52,000 by the time Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. That rate of expansion, from a minor bodyguard unit to a force comparable in size to a small army, was not accidental. Himmler was actively recruiting, actively promoting, and actively distinguishing the SS from every other Nazi organization in ways designed to attract a specific kind of man. Educated, ideologically committed, organizationally ambitious, and prepared to execute orders with a thoroughness that the cruder elements of the SA could not consistently deliver. He was building a professional class of ideological enforcers, and he was doing it with remarkable efficiency. In the summer of 1931, Himmler created the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, or security service. The occasion, according to the documentary record, was a revolt within the Berlinsee against Hitler's leadership, a revolt that the SS helped suppress, an act of loyalty that earned the SS its formal motto, "My honor is loyalty." The SD began as an intelligence-gathering operation, initially focused on tracking opponents within the Nazi Party itself, then expanding to monitor political parties, government officials, and eventually the entire spectrum of what the party defined as its enemies. In August of 1934, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess would formally announce that the SD was the sole intelligence gathering and evaluating agency in the entire Third Reich. A consolidation of domestic surveillance authority that, by any comparative historical standard, represented an extraordinary concentration of power in a single organization. On the last day of 1931, Himmler established the Race and Settlement Office of the SS, the Rasse- und Siedlungsamt. Its initial mandate was to evaluate applications from SS men seeking permission to marry under a new internal directive Himmler had issued, which required SS men to prove their families were of Aryan descent going back to the year 1800. Each man approved for SS membership received what was called a Sippenbuch, a genealogical record book detailing his genetic history. Himmler expected each SS marriage to produce at least 4 children, explicitly framing it in terms of demographic engineering, creating a self-replenishing pool of genetically vetted SS candidates for future generations. The actual results were disappointing by his own metrics. Fewer than 40% of SS men married under the program, and those who did produced on average roughly 1 child, not 4. But the bureaucratic apparatus itself, the office, the forms, the categories, the assessments, was not without consequence. The institutional expertise, developed in determining who was racially German, would, in wartime, be applied to occupied populations, and the difference between a positive and a negative determination could mean the difference between survival and death. This is the point at which some historians, and this is a genuine historiographical debate, not a casual one, begin to see the outlines of what Himmler was actually constructing. Not just a security force, not just a party militia, but a parallel state, an organization with its own personnel system, its own judicial apparatus, its own intelligence network, its own criteria for membership, its own marriage law, and its own racial classification system. Each of these functions duplicated and, by design, eventually superseded the equivalent function of the German state. By the time the Nazis came to power in 1933, the SS was not subordinate to Germany. It was, structurally, prepared to become Germany. In 1929 and 1930, as the SS was growing, and the Nazi Party was capitalizing on the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression, unemployment in Germany climbed steeply through this period, the Weimar coalition government proving unable to respond adequately. Himmler was also navigating the complicated politics of the party itself. In September of 1930, he was elected to the Reichstag for the first time. He was a deputy, a public figure, a man with a platform, and yet the parliamentary role was, for Himmler, almost entirely instrumental, a vehicle for visibility and influence, not an end in itself. He had very little interest in democratic process. He had enormous interest in institutional power, and the Reichstag gave him access to networks and resources that the SS alone could not provide. The relationship between the SS and the SA during these years was, to use a precise technical term from the organizational literature, adversarial cooperation. They shared political goals and a patron in Hitler, but competed fiercely for resources, recruits, and authority. The SA, under Ernst Röhm, was a mass movement. By the early 1930s, it numbered in the millions, dwarfing both the SS and the German army itself. Himmler understood that he could not compete with the SA on the SA's terms. He did not try to. Instead, he built an organization whose value proposition was fundamentally different. Not numbers, but quality. Not street presence, but administrative penetration. Not brute force, but structured, accountable, deniable force. The SS in 1933 was smaller than the SA by an enormous margin. It was also, by any honest assessment, a far more dangerous organization, because it had a system, and Himmler's systems worked. One more appointment from this period requires attention. In 1931, Himmler made a personnel decision that would have consequences extending far beyond what either man could have foreseen. He appointed a young former naval officer, named Reinhard Heydrich to head the new intelligence service. Heydrich was 27 years old. He had been dismissed from the German Navy the previous year following a personal scandal involving a woman to whom he had made promises he did not keep, an event that had left him professionally ruined and personally humiliated. He was brilliant, cold, organizationally gifted, and prepared to work with a total ferocity that even Himmler found useful. The relationship between the two men would become one of the defining organizational partnerships of the Third Reich, a subject that warrants its own extended examination in a later chapter. For now, it is sufficient to note that in placing Heydrich in charge of SS intelligence, Himmler demonstrated the talent that his own biographers consistently identify as central to his success, an ability to recognize operational capability in subordinates, deploy it without jealousy, and contain it through structural control. By the time Hitler became Chancellor on the 30th of January, 1933, Heinrich Himmler had transformed a 280-man bodyguard detail into a 52,000-member organization with its own intelligence service, its own racial classification apparatus, its own marriage laws, its own internal court system, and a documented loyalty to Hitler that no other institution in Germany could match. He had done this in 4 years. He had done it largely through paperwork, through decrees and offices and criteria and categories. If the story of the SS's rise to power has a dominant aesthetic, it is not a rally at night with torches burning. It is a man at a desk, writing precise institutional requirements in a neat hand and filing them in the right order. Chapter 3. The Machinery of Control. Police, Gestapo, and the State within a state, 1933 to 1936. The Nazis came to power in Germany on the 30th of January, 1933. By the evening of that day, SA men were marching through the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin with torches. By the following morning, the serious work of consolidating power had begun. And the serious work of consolidating power in the Third Reich was Himmler's work, while Hermann Goering was maneuvering in Prussia, while Joseph Goebbels was managing the propaganda apparatus, while Hitler was performing the role of chancellor for the conservative politicians who believed they could control him. Himmler was doing something less visible and more consequential, acquiring police departments, one by one, state by state. He was building toward a unified national security apparatus under SS control. It was the most methodical power grab in the history of modern statecraft, and it was executed with a precision that, even 80 years later, reads as close to surgical. On the 9th of March, 1933, 38 days after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, Himmler was named Provisional President of Police in Munich. 3 weeks later, he was named Commander of the Bavarian Political Police. This was the template. Munich first, then Bavaria, then the other German states one by one. The method was consistent. Himmler would approach the senior Nazi official in each German state, establish a relationship, position an SS ally in the relevant police post, and progressively shift operational authority from the state apparatus to SS hands. By late 1934, he had obtained command of each of the state political police departments in Germany and centralized them within a single new agency headquartered in Berlin, the Geheime Staatspolizei, or Gestapo. The word has entered the language as a synonym for secret political terror. At the time of its creation, it was technically an administrative restructuring. This is the part of Himmler's career that requires particular attention, because it is where the organizational historian and the moral historian must speak simultaneously. What Himmler built between 1933 and 1936 was a security apparatus deliberately designed to operate outside the normal constraints of German law. This was not an accidental byproduct of Nazi governance. It was an explicit design choice. Himmler understood and articulated with some sophistication in internal communications that survive. That the ideological goals of the Nazi regime could not be achieved through the ordinary instruments of the state, because those instruments were bound by legal norms that would obstruct or delay the implementation of racial policy. The solution was not to reform those legal norms, but to build a parallel system of authority that was not subject to them. This is why, when Hitler appointed Himmler to his combined role and granted the SS direct authority from the Führer himself, Himmler was described as being outside the legal constraints of the German state. That phrase is not rhetorical. It was a precise, deliberate constitutional arrangement. The concentration camp at Dachau, established in March of 1933, less than 3 months after the Nazis came to power, was the most concrete early expression of this philosophy. Hitler had stated explicitly that he did not want Dachau to be merely a prison or detention facility. Himmler appointed Theodor Eicke, an ardent Nazi and convicted felon, to run the camp in June of 1933. Eicke developed what became the operational model for the entire concentration camp system that followed. The complete isolation of prisoners from the outside world, elaborate roll, calls, and work assignments, the use of physical force and execution to maintain obedience, and a strict disciplinary code that applied equally to guards. Uniforms were issued to both prisoners and guards. The guards' collars carried the Totenkopf, the death's head insignia. By the end of 1934, Himmler had taken direct control of the camps under SS authority, creating a separate division called the SS Totenkopfverband, or Death's Head units, to administer them. The death toll in those early camps was high. They were not, at this stage, extermination facilities. That development came later. But the institutional architecture for systematic mass incarceration was in place by the mid-1930s, nearly a decade before the death camps of Eastern Europe began operating. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1934, an event occurred that permanently altered the balance of power within the Nazi state, and that cemented Himmler's position beyond challenge. Since the early months of 1934, Hitler and other senior Nazi leaders had been growing increasingly alarmed by the behavior and ambitions of Ernst Röhm, the SA chief. Röhm had socialist sympathies, a vision of a revolutionary second phase of the Nazi movement, and a belief that the SA, which by this point numbered approximately 3 million men, should absorb the regular German army and become the sole armed force of the state. He was lobbying openly for appointment as Minister of Defense. He was a problem. Hitler authorized the action on the 21st of June. Between the 30th of June and the 2nd of July, 1934, in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, the SS, in coordination with elements of the Gestapo, arrested and in many cases executed between 85 and 200 members of the SA leadership, along with a number of other political opponents. Röhm himself, given the option of suicide, refused and was shot by 2 SS officers. The operation was swift, organized, and total. On the 20th of July, 1934, Hitler announced that the SS was henceforth an independent organization, answerable only to himself. Himmler's title of Reichsführer SS became formally equivalent to a field marshal's rank within the German armed forces. The SA, stripped of its leadership and its threat, was reconstituted as a sports and training organization. The SS had no rival. The legal formalization of Himmler's police empire followed in June of 1936, when Hitler decreed the unification of all police forces in the Reich and named Himmler Reichsführer SS and Chief of German Police, a double title that united ideological party force and state law enforcement in a single office for the first time in German history. Himmler was nominally still subordinate to Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick. In practice, the police were now a division of the SS, and hence independent of Frick's authority entirely. This arrangement was the product of careful political maneuvering involving Goering's support, a sequence of meetings with Frick that Heydrich managed, and ultimately a direct instruction from Hitler to Frick to accept the proposals. It was, like so many of Himmler's advances, achieved not through confrontation, but through structural maneuver, through making the institutional arrangements work in his favor before the political conflict could fully develop. Following the June decree, Himmler reorganized the police apparatus with characteristic thoroughness. The Gestapo and the criminal police were merged into the security police under Heydrich's command. The uniformed police forces across Germany were amalgamated into the Ordnungspolizei, the Order Police, which became a branch of the SS. The Reich Criminal Police Office was created to unify all criminal investigation agencies. Each reorganization reduced the number of external oversight mechanisms. Each new office created another jurisdiction in which the SS was the authority of first and last resort. By 1936, a German citizen could be arrested by the Gestapo, detained in a concentration camp, and held indefinitely. And not one institution in the German state had both the authority and the means to intervene. That was not an accident of circumstances. It was an engineering achievement, and Himmler was its engineer. In this same period, the Nuremberg Laws of September 19th, 1935, formalized racial discrimination into German statute for the first time, prohibiting marriage between Jewish and non-Jewish Germans, stripping Jews of citizenship rights, forbidding the employment of non-Jewish women under 45 in Jewish households. These laws did not originate in Himmler's office, but they complemented his organizational framework precisely. The Race and Settlement Office of the SS, which had been evaluating racial purity since 1931, suddenly found that its internal expertise had become state doctrine. The bureaucratic apparatus that had been vetting SS marriages was now, in effect, a template for the entire German legal system. It is worth pausing on 1936, not just as a year of administrative consolidation, but as a year that demands historical reckoning. By June of that year, Heinrich Himmler, 35 years old, a former agricultural student who had failed to see combat in the First World War, who had carried a flag during a failed coup attempt in a Munich beer hall, controlled Germany's entire domestic intelligence apparatus, its secret police, its criminal police, its uniformed law enforcement, and its concentration camp system. He did not control the German army. He did not yet control Germany's foreign policy. But inside Germany, and inside the growing network of German-occupied territories, there was no institution with both the authority and the operational capability to constrain him. 3 years of systematic institutional expansion had produced that result. The quiet boy from Munich had become the second most powerful man in Germany, and he had done it without a single battle, without a single dramatic confrontation, without any of the theatrical violence that characterizes most historical accounts of Nazi power. He had done it with paperwork. That fact should give any student of history pause. Chapter 4. The Race Engineers, Ideology, Eugenics, and the SS World Order, 1933 to 1939. There is a tendency, when examining the institutional history of the Third Reich, to treat ideology as something separate from administration, as the coloring provided to decisions that were fundamentally about power. That separation is analytically convenient, but it is historically false, and it is particularly false in Himmler's case. Himmler was not a cynical man who used racial ideology as a tool for political advancement. He was a true believer in a sense that very few of his colleagues matched. He believed in the biological theories. He believed in the historical mythology. He believed that Germany was a racial organism under existential threat, that the enemies of that organism were identifiable and measurable, and that the correct response was not political debate, but scientific management. Understanding that belief, its texture, its sources, its specific intellectual content, is essential to understanding why the SS under his leadership was not simply an instrument of repression, but a genuine attempt to engineer an entirely new human social order. The intellectual foundations of Himmler's racial worldview were assembled over years of deliberate reading, beginning in his university years and continuing throughout his life. His biographers, working from his surviving diaries and correspondence, have traced his influences with some precision. He absorbed the standard Völkisch nationalist literature of the Weimar period, the romantic nationalism of the 19th century, refracted through social Darwinist biology and occultist Germanic mythology. He was particularly influenced by writers who connected German national identity to what they described as Nordic racial heritage, a fantasy of pre-Christian Germanic civilization, rooted in the landscape of Northern Europe, corrupted by Christianity, industrialization, and what the literature consistently identified as Jewish influence. He found in Walther Darré, whom he encountered through the Arteman League, a Völkisch youth movement around 1927, a theorist who connected these ideas to agricultural science in ways that resonated deeply with Himmler's training. Darré's book, The Peasantry as the Life Source of the Nordic Race, became a foundational text for Himmler's thinking about racial breeding and settlement. And it was through Himmler's introduction that Darré later came to Hitler's attention and was eventually appointed Reich Minister of Food and Agriculture. The SS Race and Settlement Office, established formally at the end of 1931, was the institutional expression of this ideology. But its reach extended far beyond marriage screening. Himmler's vision, articulated in internal documents and speeches from the mid-1930s onward, was nothing less than the biological transformation of Germany over multiple generations. He believed that within a few decades after a successful war, Germany could, through selective breeding and the systematic removal of inferior genetic lines, produce a population that was Nordic in appearance, physical constitution, and psychological character. He was quite explicit about applying the principles of animal husbandry to humans. He expected SS men not merely to avoid marriage with racially inferior women, but to actively propagate, producing at least 4 children per marriage, creating a self-replenishing genetic reserve for the SS itself, and eventually for the German nation. The actual results of these programs were, from Himmler's own perspective, deeply disappointing. Fewer than 40% of SS men married under the formal program, and the average SS family produced approximately 1 child, nowhere near the 4 Himmler required. He found this frustrating, and the documentary record shows repeated attempts to incentivize higher birth rates through material benefits, housing allocations, and various forms of ideological encouragement. None of it worked as intended. The gap between Himmler's demographic ambitions and the actual behavior of his SS men is one of the more reliable small indicators that even within the most rigidly controlled ideological organization in Nazi Germany, human beings did not behave like breeding stock on command. Alongside the eugenics programs, Himmler pursued a project of cultural and spiritual re-engineering that has attracted substantial scholarly attention, particularly in recent decades. He was vehemently hostile to Christianity, not merely indifferent to it, but actively, programmatically opposed to it. According to his biographer Peter Longerich, Himmler believed that a central task of the SS should be acting as the vanguard in overcoming Christianity and restoring what he described as a Germanic way of living. In 1937, he declared explicitly, and this is a recorded statement, not a reconstruction, that they lived in an era of the ultimate conflict with Christianity, and that the SS bore a specific mission to provide the German people with non-Christian ideological foundations for their lives. He had his personal staff collaborate with academics to develop a framework for replacing Christian tradition with a reconstructed Germanic cultural heritage. This project led to the establishment of the Deutschrechtliches Institute at the University of Bonn, headed by Professor Karl Eckart, an institutional investment in cultural re-engineering that was, by most measures, a failure, but that reveals the scope of what Himmler was actually attempting. The Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Research Organization, formally incorporated into the SS in 1939, was another expression of this project. It funded expeditions and research programs designed to locate archaeological and anthropological evidence of the Nordic racial heritage Himmler believed underlay German civilization. Scholars have debated how seriously even senior SS officers took the more extreme Ahnenerbe projects, but the funding commitments were real, and the institutional investment was substantial. Himmler himself visited various sites of prehistoric German archaeology and took a personal interest in research that he believed supported his civilizational narrative. The details of this engagement, a man commanding the largest internal security apparatus in Europe, also personally reviewing reports on pre-Roman Germanic settlement patterns, speak to a quality of his character that is difficult to categorize simply. He was not performing ideology for others. He was living inside it. By the mid-1930s, the SS had also begun constructing what historians sometimes describe as a parallel economy. Under the direction of Administrator Oswald Pohl, who organized the economic enterprises of the SS, a holding company called Deutsche Wirtschaftsbetriebe, German Economic Enterprise, was established in 1940, though its precursors developed through the 30s. This entity owned housing corporations, factories, publishing houses, and various other commercial enterprises. The long-term logic of SS economic independence was clear. Himmler wanted an organization that was not financially dependent on the German state or the Nazi Party apparatus. An SS that could fund its own operations was an SS that could operate with greater autonomy. This dimension of SS institutional history is less frequently discussed in popular accounts than the police and intelligence functions, but it was integral to Himmler's design. The Nuremberg Rally of 1935, which is preserved in Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph of the Will, provides the most visually familiar image of the SS in this period. The columns of men in black uniforms, the rigid geometry of the formations, the theatrical relationship between the Führer on his dais and the massed ranks of his party soldiers. What the camera does not show is the bureaucratic substance that made those formations meaningful. The marriage records, the racial assessments, the genealogical books, the internal court decisions, the intelligence files, the camp regulations. The visual language of the SS was designed for public consumption. The administrative language was where the power actually resided. Himmler was comfortable with both, but he lived in the latter. The outbreak of the Kristallnacht pogrom on the 9th and 10th of November 1938, in which Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues across Germany were attacked. Jewish men were beaten, and approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, showed both the organizational capacity and the limits of Himmler's model. The pogrom itself was orchestrated primarily by Goebbels and the SA, with Hitler's approval, and Himmler's response was characteristically bureaucratic rather than theatrical. The SS was rapidly deployed to take control of the arrested men, to manage the incarceration, to process the administrative consequences. There is evidence in the documentary record that Himmler was personally uncomfortable with the disorder and destruction of the pogrom, not for moral reasons, but because uncontrolled street violence conflicted with his institutional preference for managed, systematic action. He would spend the following years replacing spontaneous violence with industrial process, Between 1933 and 1939, the concentration camp population grew from a few thousand political prisoners in a handful of camps to roughly 27,000 inmates across 6 main camps. The camps had expanded their categories of incarceration well beyond political opponents. Jews, Roma and Sinti people, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, what the regime classified as asocials, and recidivist criminals had all been added to the population under a Hitler decree of December 1937 that authorized incarceration of anyone deemed undesirable by the regime. Death rates were high. The camps were not yet extermination facilities, but they were institutions in which survival was not guaranteed, and in which the distinction between incarceration and execution was increasingly managed by administrative decision rather than judicial process. The machinery was built. The question that the opening of the war would answer was what precisely it would be used for. Chapter 5. The War Begins. Poland, the Einsatzgruppen, and the Architecture of Occupied Terror, 1939 to 1941. Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September, 1939. Before the first German soldier crossed the Polish border, Himmler, Heinrich, and a third officer, Heinrich Himmler, head of the Gestapo, had already planned and executed a false flag operation code named Operation Himmler, designed to manufacture the pretext for the invasion. German soldiers dressed in Polish uniforms conducted stage border incidents intended to simulate Polish aggression against Germany. The incidents were documented, photographed, and presented in Nazi propaganda as the provocation that justified the German military response. It was by any historical standard a meticulous deception, and it tells you something about where Himmler sat in the decision-making architecture of the Third Reich in September of 1939. He was not merely a domestic security administrator. He was a strategic actor, involved in the planning of the war itself from its opening hours. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS task forces, had originally been formed by Heydrich before the war to secure government papers and offices in territories taken over by Germany during the annexation of Austria and the occupation of Czechoslovakia. In Poland, their mandate was fundamentally different. Authorized by Hitler and operating under Himmler and Heydrich's direction, these units followed the German army into Poland as death squads, tasked with the systematic killing of the Polish intelligentsia, clergy, political leadership, and Jewish population. By the end of 1939, the Einsatzgruppen and affiliated units had murdered approximately 65,000 Polish civilians. Wehrmacht units also participated. The killings were not incidental to the occupation. They were a deliberate policy of decapitating Polish civil society to prevent the emergence of organized resistance. The documentary record of German army commanders' responses to these killings in Poland is significant and is a subject of genuine historiographical debate. Several senior Wehrmacht officers, including General Johannes Blaskowitz, then commander of German forces in occupied Poland, filed formal protests with the Army High Command, objecting to the killings on both moral and operational grounds. Blaskowitz's memoranda, which survive, argued that the conduct of the SS units was corrupting the discipline of German soldiers and would have long-term negative operational consequences. Hitler's response, according to the record, was contemptuous. He explicitly structured the chain of command for the Soviet campaign 2 years later to prevent any repeat of these internal military objections, ensuring that the Einsatzgruppen in the East would operate with even greater independence from Wehrmacht oversight. On the 7th of October 1939, Himmler's 39th birthday, Hitler appointed him to an additional position, Reichskommissar for the Consolidation of German Ethnic Stock, or Reichskommissar für die Festigung deutschen Volkstums. This appointment authorized Himmler and the SS to plan, initiate, and control the pace of German resettlement projects in occupied Poland and later in the Soviet Union. In practical terms, this meant that Himmler's organization now had the final say over three of the most consequential determinations that could be made about a human being in German-occupied territory: whether they were German, where ethnic Germans should live, and which populations should be moved out or eliminated to make room for German settlers. The logic that had begun in the SS Marriage Decree of 1931, the bureaucratic determination of racial identity, had now been scaled up to an entire occupied country. The process that followed in occupied Poland in 1939 and 1940 was described in internal SS documentation with a clinical terminology that is itself historically significant. Polish civilians, both Jewish and non-Jewish, were subjected to what the documents called resettlement. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced from the territories annexed to the Reich and moved into a German zone of occupation called the General Government. Jews were concentrated into ghettos in the major Polish cities: Warsaw, Krakow, Łódź, where they were subjected to severe restrictions, forced labor, and deliberately inadequate food rations. The language of the documents concealed the conditions with bureaucratic precision. Words like resettlement, transfer, and evacuation described processes in which large numbers of people died from exposure, starvation, and deliberate violence. The construction of Auschwitz began in the spring of 1940, on Himmler's orders, on the site of former Polish military barracks near the town of Oświęcim. It was initially conceived as a camp for Polish political prisoners, a facility within the expanding concentration camp system. The gas chambers came later, in 1941. The industrial scale that Auschwitz eventually represented was not fully visible in 1940. What was visible, to anyone with access to the internal SS planning documents, was the logic that demanded ever larger facilities for the incarceration of a population category that Himmler's system was defining in real time as outside the boundaries of civilized humanity. The camp at this stage was one piece of a system that was still being designed. The design was advancing rapidly. The period between the fall of France in June of 1940 and the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941 was, in retrospect, a period of institutional preparation for the most catastrophic phase of the war. Germany had conquered most of continental Europe with startling speed. The SS administrative apparatus was extended into each occupied territory: Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and in each case, the same institutional logic applied. Himmler's representatives established security police operations, began compiling lists, established the administrative basis for the identification and incarceration of Jews and political opponents. The speed varied, the template did not. It was also in this period that the Waffen-SS, the armed SS force, began its serious expansion. Himmler had persuaded Hitler in late 1939 to permit the establishment of an armed SS force capable of operating alongside the regular Wehrmacht. Initially restricted to 4 divisions, the Waffen-SS grew throughout the war to more than 38 divisions, eventually putting approximately 500,000 men under arms. Its combat performance was variable. Some units achieved notable military records. Units composed largely of conscripts from Eastern Europe after 1943 were, by Himmler's own assessment, generally below standard. But the institutional function of the Waffen-SS was not purely military. It created a parallel command and operations structure that Himmler could use to extend SS authority into the combat zone, and that provided a pool of combat-experienced personnel who could be transferred between military and security functions with administrative ease. The relationship between the SS and the Wehrmacht in this period was, as historians have documented extensively, complicated and frequently adversarial. Senior Wehrmacht officers were professionally contemptuous of the Waffen-SS in its early iterations, viewing it as a party militia with inadequate military training and an inflated sense of its own importance. Himmler was acutely aware of this contempt and responded to it with characteristic patience. He worked to improve the military performance of SS units, invested in officer training, and systematically exploited military setbacks to argue for greater SS involvement in the actual conduct of the war. He played a long game. The Wehrmacht generals who dismissed the Waffen-SS in 1939 found their institutional authority progressively eroded through the following years, as military defeats created political openings that Himmler consistently exploited. The day before the German invasion of the Soviet Union, on the 21st of June, 1941, Himmler commissioned the preparation of a planning document that would have consequences extending far beyond the military campaign it was designed to support. The General Plan Ost, General Plan for the East, outlined a program under which the Baltic states, Poland, Western Ukraine, and Byelorussia would be conquered and resettled by approximately 10 million German citizens over a period of 20 to 30 years. The current residents, estimated at approximately 31 million people, would be expelled eastward, subjected to starvation and forced labor, or simply killed. The plan was approved by Hitler in May of 1942. In a statement that the historical record preserves with complete accuracy, Himmler declared, "It is a question of existence, thus it will be a racial struggle of pitiless severity, in the course of which 20 to 30 million Slavs and Jews will perish through military actions and crises of food supply." That sentence was written before the Holocaust's industrialized phase had begun. It was not a prediction. It was a plan. Chapter 6. Operation Barbarossa and the Killing Fields. Einsatzgruppen in the Soviet Union, 1941 to 1942. The invasion of the Soviet Union began on the 22nd of June, 1941, along a front stretching roughly 3,000 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It was the largest military operation in the history of warfare, involving approximately 3 million German and Axis soldiers, attacking a country of roughly 190 million people. From a purely military standpoint, the opening weeks were extraordinary. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. German armored units advanced at speeds that had no historical precedent. From Himmler's standpoint, the military campaign was both the context for and the cover of a parallel operation that he had been planning since March of 1941. The systematic killing of every Jew, every Soviet political commissar, every Roma, and every person with a disability living in German-occupied Soviet territory. The Einsatzgruppen deployed in the Soviet Union in 1941 were different in scale and mandate from those used in Poland in 1939. There were 4 main groups, designated A, B, C, and D, each assigned to follow a different German army group. Each group was subdivided into smaller units called Sonderkommandos and Einsatzkommandos. Their total strength at the start of the campaign was approximately 3,000 men. Their explicit mandate, formalized in a series of directives that the historical record preserves, was the physical elimination of the identified categories of the Soviet population. The legal framework, such as it was, rested on Hitler's special directive authorizing the Reichsführer SS to act independently and on his own responsibility in the areas behind the front line, outside the normal jurisdiction of the Wehrmacht. The killings began within days of the invasion. The organizational and logistical pattern was documented by the Einsatzgruppen themselves in regular reports called Ereignismeldungen, event reports, sent back to the Recha in Berlin. These reports, which survive in substantial numbers, record the killing operations with the kind of statistical precision that characterized all of Himmler's institutions. Numbers of people killed, dates, locations, categories. They are among the most disturbing documents produced by any institution in the history of the modern world. And they are also, from a historical research standpoint, invaluable, because they were written by perpetrators for administrative purposes, which means they were not intended as propaganda and cannot easily be dismissed as exaggeration. Within the first 8 months of the Soviet campaign, hundreds of thousands of people had been killed by the Einsatzgruppen and affiliated units, including German police battalions and, in many instances, local collaborators recruited from the occupied populations of Ukraine, Lithuania, and other territories. The scale of killing at individual sites was often very large. The most documented single event from this period, Babi Yar near Kiev, occurred over the 29th and 30th of September 1941, when more than 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children were killed by Einsatzgruppe C and German police units in 2 days. The event is not fabricated. It is documented in the perpetrator's own records, in survivor testimony, in post-war trial evidence, and in extensive scholarly literature. The historical consensus on its scale is firm. It was in August of 1941 that Himmler personally witnessed a killing operation for the first time. He traveled to Minsk, where he observed the shooting of approximately 100 Jewish men. The accounts of what happened come from multiple sources, including witnesses and post-war testimony, and they agree on the essential elements. Himmler was visibly shaken. He went pale, he swayed, and he was reportedly splattered when the body of a victim fell near where he stood. Karl Wolff, one of his senior staff officers, had to physically steady him and lead him away from the graves. What happened next is crucial to understanding Himmler's specific role in the Holocaust. He did not order the killings stopped. He did not revise the policy. Instead, nauseated and shaken, he expressed concern. And his concern was not for the victims, but for the psychological effect of such work on his SS men. He immediately began directing the search for alternative killing methods that would be less personally traumatic for the perpetrators. That search led directly to the gas chambers, the use of Zyklon B, a pesticide previously used in German concentration camps for delousing, at Auschwitz was first tested in September of 1941 in an experiment conducted on Soviet prisoners of war. By early 1942, the camp at Auschwitz had been substantially expanded, with purpose-built gas chambers added, and the operational model for industrial-scale killing was being refined. In December of 1941, Himmler ordered Reinhard Heydrich to, in his own documented words, develop the most effective and the quickest possible method for destroying the Jewish community in Europe. This instruction preceded the Wannsee Conference of the 20th of January, 1942, at which Heydrich convened senior Nazi officials and outlined the administrative plan for what the regime called the final solution of the Jewish question. Chapter 7. The Wannsee Conference and the Final Solution. Bureaucracy as Murder, 1942. The Wannsee Conference has sometimes been misunderstood in popular accounts as the moment at which the decision to murder Europe's Jews was made. That is not what happened at Wannsee. The killing had already begun. In the Soviet Union, in mobile gas vans operating in occupied Poland, in the camps at Chelmno and Belzec, which had received their first transports of Jewish prisoners before January of 1942. What Wannsee represented was something more precise, more administrative, and in many ways more sinister than a single decision. It was the moment at which the systematic murder of 11 million human beings, the number cited in Heydrich's own opening remarks, was formalized as a government policy to be coordinated across ministerial departments, railway networks, police jurisdictions, and occupied territories from Norway to Greece, from France to the occupied Soviet Union. It was, in the most precise sense of the phrase, a management meeting. Reinhard Heydrich chaired the meeting at a villa on the Wannsee Lake in Berlin on the 20th of January, 1942. 15 senior officials attended, representing the major ministries of the German state, the SS, the general government in Poland, and the occupied Eastern territories. Himmler was not personally present. His institutional fingerprints were on every aspect of what was discussed, but the conference was Heydrich's operational performance, under a mandate from both Göring and Himmler. The minutes, taken by Adolf Eichmann and preserved in their entirety, which is itself historically significant, given how many Nazi documents were deliberately destroyed, record the meeting in the careful, euphemistic administrative language that characterized all SS documentation relating to the killing programs. Words like evacuation, special treatment, and resettlement were used throughout. The absence of explicit language did not obscure the meaning to anyone in the room. Everyone present understood what was being discussed. What Heydrich outlined, according to the surviving minutes, was a systematic process for identifying, concentrating, transporting, and processing the Jewish populations of every country under German occupation or influence. The process was to move from west to east. Jewish populations in Western and Northern Europe would be transported to the Eastern killing facilities, which were already in operation or under construction. Each country's Jewish population was listed by approximate number, from France and Hungary down to tiny communities in Estonia and Albania. The numbers were not Heydrich's invention. They were drawn from intelligence surveys compiled by the SD over the preceding years. That intelligence infrastructure, built by Himmler beginning in 1931, was now being applied to its ultimate administrative purpose. The discussion at Wannsee also addressed a question that had been generating bureaucratic friction within the German administration for months: the legal and logistical status of Jewish people in mixed marriages and their children. These groups, referred to in the minutes as Mischlinge, or persons of mixed heritage, represented a genuine administrative challenge because their incarceration and killing required either ignoring or overriding German civil law in ways that even some Nazi officials found procedurally uncomfortable. Heydrich's proposed solution was gradual: sterilization for those who remained in Germany, deportation, and killing for those who could not be distinguished from the broader Jewish community. The meeting did not reach full consensus on this category, and the Wannsee follow-up conferences in March and October of 1942 continued to debate the technical solutions to what one participating official described as the most difficult problem of the entire program. That a group of officials at a government conference could use the phrase "most difficult problem" to describe the administrative complexity of murdering a subcategory of human beings says something about the depth to which bureaucratic normalization had penetrated this apparatus by early 1942. In the months following Wannsee, the killing infrastructure in occupied Poland was enormously expanded. 3 new death camps, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Belzec, were built under a program known as Operation Reinhard, named in honor of Reinhard Heydrich following his assassination in Prague in June of 1942. The camps operated under a different model from Auschwitz. There was no significant labor extraction at these 3 facilities. Their purpose was exclusively killing, achieved through carbon monoxide poisoning, using engine exhaust directed into sealed chambers, later replaced at Treblinka with stationary engines producing a more reliable concentration of lethal gas. Together, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Belzec killed approximately 1.75 million people, predominantly Polish Jews, between the spring of 1942 and the autumn of 1943. The historical record for these camps is less complete than for Auschwitz because the Germans deliberately demolished the facilities and attempted to erase the evidence in the final phase of the war. But the surviving documentation and the extensive post-war testimony of perpetrators and the tiny number of survivors establishes the scale beyond any serious historical dispute. In this same period, the Warsaw Ghetto, established in 1940 and at its maximum holding more than 400,000 Jewish people in conditions of deliberate, lethal overcrowding and starvation, began to be liquidated. Between July and September of 1942, the German administration deported approximately 265,000 people from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka death camp. The transport system was coordinated through the Reich Railway, the Reichsbahn, which billed the SS for the passenger transport at standard second-class rail rates for deportees traveling one way, and reduced child rates for children. The corporate normalization embedded in that billing arrangement is itself a document of what Hannah Arendt, in a later and much debated formulation, would call the banality of evil. The phrase has been contested by historians who feel it underestimates the ideological fervor of perpetrators. But the billing document itself, a railway company charging for murder transport at discounted family rates, resists easy interpretation in either direction. Himmler's personal engagement with the killing programs in 1942 was intensive and documented. He made inspection visits to Auschwitz in July of 1942, during which he personally observed a gassing operation. He expressed satisfaction with what he saw, according to accounts preserved in witness testimony, and ordered the expansion of the facility's capacity. He gave speeches to SS commanders in which he described the killing of Europe's Jews as a historical necessity, a phrase he used consistently, and that the documentary record, particularly from the Posen speeches of October of 1943, preserves in his own voice. He was not a man in denial about what was happening. He was its administrator and its chief advocate. The relationship between Himmler and Heydrich in this period has attracted particular attention from historians, precisely because of the question of comparative authority. Heydrich was, by every available account, the more intellectually formidable operational mind, faster, colder, more inventive in his methods, and, importantly, more genuinely feared by other SS officers than Himmler himself. Himmler was aware of Heydrich's capabilities, and, according to several historians, was also aware of the political threat that Heydrich represented. The structure that Himmler had designed, in which Heydrich commanded the Russia from which all the major instruments of terror operated, gave Heydrich an enormous institutional base. Whether Himmler ever intended to neutralize that base, and whether Heydrich's death in June of 1942 changed Himmler's strategic calculations, is a question that the documentary record does not fully resolve. Heydrich was attacked by British-trained Czech and Slovak paratroopers in Prague on the 27th of May, 1942. An operation code named Anthropoid, authorized by the Czechoslovak government in exile in London. He died of his wounds on the 4th of June. The German reprisals were immediate and savage. The village of Lides was destroyed, its male inhabitants shot, its women and children sent to concentration camps. Himmler gave the eulogy at Heydrich's state funeral in Berlin on the 9th of June, describing Heydrich as one of the best National Socialists, one of the strongest defenders of the German Reich concept, and one of the greatest opponents of all enemies of the Reich. Behind the ceremonial language, the loss was operationally significant. No single individual was capable of filling Heydrich's role, and Himmler's decision to restructure the Reich command, rather than appoint a single successor of comparable authority, suggests that he had, consciously or not, made an institutional adjustment in response to Heydrich's death that consolidated authority more firmly in his own hands. By the end of 1942, the killing programs were operating at their maximum pace. Auschwitz-Birkenau, substantially expanded following Himmler's July inspection, had a theoretical capacity of several thousand kills per day in its gas chamber and crematorium complex. The death camps of Operation Reinhard were receiving transports from Poland, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Greece. The Einsatzgruppen in the Soviet Union had, by the estimates drawn from their own reports, killed more than 500,000 people in the first year of the campaign. The total death toll in the Holocaust from all causes exceeded 1 million by the end of 1942, and it was still accelerating. Himmler sat at the center of this machine, reviewing reports, approving expansions, and managing personnel. The same administrative practices he had applied to the SS marriage program in 1931 now applied to the largest institutionally organized killing operation in human history. Chapter 8. Himmler's Empire, the Rush Poles Economic Office, and the SS State, 1942 to 1943. One of the persistent misunderstandings about the SS at its height is that it was primarily a military or paramilitary organization, a force of soldiers and policemen organized to fight enemies and suppress opposition. That picture is partially accurate and largely misleading. By 1942, the SS had evolved into something that is more accurately described as a state within a state, an institution with its own military forces, its own police, its own intelligence apparatus, its own judicial system, its own economic enterprises, its own construction and engineering capacity, its own medical research programs, its own agricultural operations, and its own racially driven resettlement and demographic planning offices. Himmler presided over this ensemble of institutions, not as a military commander presides over an army, but as a chief executive presides over a diversified conglomerate, setting strategic direction, managing competing institutional interests, making personnel appointments, and reviewing financial and operational reports. The scale of the organization he commanded by 1942 was, by any honest accounting, extraordinary. The institutional architecture of the SS at its height can be broadly organized around two axes: the security and police functions, concentrated in the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Security Main Office, or Recha, established in September of 1939 under Heydrich, and the administrative and economic functions, concentrated in the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt, the SS Economic Administrative Main Office, or VA, established in February of 1942 under SS Obergruppenführer Oswald Pohl. These two great bureaucratic nodes, along with the military forces of the Waffen-SS, the Race and Settlement Office, the personal staff of the Reichsführer SS, and various subsidiary offices, constituted what contemporary historians describe as the SS main office system. A grid of authority that, by 1942, touched every aspect of the occupied territories and much of the domestic German state. The Archa under Heydrich, and after his death under the less charismatic but thoroughly capable Ernst Kaltenbrunner, was structured around 7 main offices, Ämter, in German, each responsible for a specific dimension of the security mission. Amt Tor Vier was the Gestapo, headed by Heinrich Müller, a man who, unusually among senior Nazi officials, has never been definitively confirmed to have died in May of 1945, a biographical gap that historians and intelligence agencies have noted without resolution. Amt 6 was the Foreign Intelligence Service. Amt 7 was responsible for what the SS described as ideological research, the monitoring, cataloguing, and combating of philosophical and religious opposition to National Socialism. Each Amt generated its own paperwork, its own files, its own intelligence products. By the mid-war years, the Recha had offices in every major city of German-occupied Europe, and its files on perceived enemies of the Reich numbered in the millions of individual cases. Pols WW represented a different face of the SS empire. Where the RSA was in the business of identifying, incapacitating, and killing people, the WW was in the business of extracting value from the incarcerated. From 1942 onward, the concentration camp system was formally integrated into the WH administrative structure, which meant that camp inmates were managed not purely as prisoners, but as a labor resource to be allocated to SS-owned enterprises, German industrial companies, and the German military's construction needs. Companies including the massive SS-owned construction enterprise Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke, German earth and stoneworks, operated quarries, brickworks, and construction sites using concentration camp labor. The largest and most consequential labor allocation program was the provision of Auschwitz camp inmates to IG Farben's synthetic rubber facility at Monowitz, which operated adjacent to the main Auschwitz complex and at peak employed tens of thousands of inmates. The death rate among inmates assigned to heavy labor was high. At Mauthausen's granite quarry in Austria, the average survival expectation for an inmate assigned to quarry work was estimated by post-war researchers at a matter of months. This integration of murder and economic exploitation was not a contradiction from Himmler's administrative perspective. It was a deliberate optimization. Not all prisoners could be productively worked. The old, the very young, the physically weak, and those categorized as racially or politically beyond any possible use were killed on arrival. Those who could work were temporarily preserved to extract economic value before their deaths. The selection process, conducted at train platforms, most famously at Auschwitz-Birkenau, was a human triage carried out by SS doctors, including the deeply documented case of Josef Mengele, who was assigned to the Auschwitz medical staff beginning in May of 1943. The selections were not spontaneous. They were institutionally required, procedurally defined, and administratively recorded. They are documented in surviving transport lists, selection records, and the post-war testimony of both perpetrators and the far smaller number of survivors. The medical programs of the SS in this period require specific attention because they represent a dimension of the SS enterprise that operated with particular personal involvement from Himmler himself. The pseudo-scientific experiments conducted at Auschwitz, Dachau, Ravensbrück, and other camps, which were investigated in detail during the doctor's trial at Nuremberg in 1946 and 1947, included high-altitude experiments, hypothermia experiments, sulfanilamide wound infection experiments, sterilizations experiments, and various programs connected to the racial ideology that underpinned the entire SS enterprise. Himmler personally corresponded with researchers about these programs, requested specific research protocols, and approved the use of camp inmates as involuntary experimental subjects. The documentation of his personal involvement is extensive and unambiguous. He was not merely aware of the medical experiments. He was their sponsor, and, in the language of modern research ethics, their principal investigator. Outside the killing programs, Himmler in 1942 and 1943 was also managing the Waffen-SS's increasingly prominent role in the military campaign on the Eastern Front, following the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943. The Sixth Army's surrender on the 2nd of February 1943 represented the single largest German defeat of the war up to that point. Hitler authorized a substantial expansion of Waffen-SS armored forces. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, comprising the Leibstandarte, SS Adolf Hitler, and Das Reich divisions, played a significant role in the German counteroffensive at the Third Battle of Kharkov in February and March of 1943, retaking the city after its abandonment by German forces the previous month. The Waffen-SS performed well in this engagement by conventional military metrics, and Hitler drew from the result a conviction that the Waffen-SS was a more reliable combat force than equivalent Wehrmacht formations. That conviction shaped force structure decisions for the remainder of the war. Himmler's relationship with the Wehrmacht General Staff throughout 1942 and 1943 was simultaneously adversarial and symbiotic. He needed the army's cooperation in the occupied territories. Without Wehrmacht logistics, and in many cases, Wehrmacht participation, the security operations in the East could not have been conducted at the scale at which they were conducted. The army, in turn, needed the SS to maintain order behind the lines as partisan resistance intensified across occupied Poland, Ukraine, and Yugoslavia. This mutual dependency gave Himmler leverage that he used consistently to expand SS authority into areas that Wehrmacht commanders regarded as their exclusive operational domain. By the end of 1943, the SS had established a significant presence in anti-partisan operations across the occupied East, with Himmler personally reviewing the reports of operations conducted in areas stretching from Greece to Norway. The scale of the SS administrative empire by the end of 1943 is difficult to communicate without numbers. The Waffen-SS had grown to more than 500,000 men in uniform, organized into more than 20 divisions, including several armored formations. The concentration camp system held hundreds of thousands of inmates across more than 1,000 documented facilities, ranging from the major camps like Auschwitz and Buchenwald to smaller satellite camps and labor installations attached to specific industrial facilities. The Russia's intelligence network covered virtually every country in Europe and maintained surveillance files on millions of individual cases. Pol's Dovier was processing the administrative details of labor allocation, camp finances, and the management of property confiscated from murdered victims on an industrial scale, and presiding over all of it, reviewing reports, approving personnel decisions, setting policy, attending to the correspondence that his subordinates generated in enormous quantities, was a 43-year-old man from Munich who had spent much of the previous decade managing his chronic stomach problems with herbal remedies prescribed by his personal masseur and health advisor, Felix Kirsten. The surreality of that conjunction, the architect of institutionalized mass murder seeking relief from digestive stress through alternative medicine, is not an anomaly. It is a data point. The late 1943 period also marked the beginning of what historians identify as a turning point in Himmler's political position within the Nazi hierarchy. With the military tide turning, after the defeat at Kursk in July of 1943, the largest tank battle in history, Germany had permanently lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The internal politics of the Nazi leadership began to shift. Himmler was widely seen, both within the regime and by Allied intelligence, as the second most powerful man in Germany. His command of the SS, the police, and the security apparatus made him indispensable to Hitler's personal security and to the regime's continued suppression of internal dissent. But with Germany's military position deteriorating and the reality of eventual defeat becoming, for those with access to accurate military intelligence, increasingly difficult to deny, Himmler began, cautiously, deniably, and with characteristic administrative care, to explore what his options might look like in a post-war world. Chapter 9. The Posen Speeches and the Circle Closes. Himmler's Open Acknowledgement, October 1943. On the 4th and 6th of October 1943, in the Posen City Hall, in what is now Poznan, Poland, Heinrich Himmler gave two speeches to senior SS officers and Nazi officials that stand alone in the documentary record of the Third Reich. In every other context, the killing programs were described in the regime's official communications through euphemism, special treatment, final solution, resettlement, evacuation. The deliberate obscuring of language was institutional policy, enforced with some rigor. Written orders using explicit language were avoided wherever possible. The chain of authority was deliberately structured to rely on oral orders and bureaucratic implication rather than documented commands. In the Posen speeches, Himmler broke with this practice in a way that has no parallel anywhere else in the surviving record of senior Nazi communications. He stood before his senior commanders, men who were, almost without exception, already direct participants in the killing programs, and described, in explicit language, the murder of Europe's Jewish population. He said, in words that survive in two separate recordings, and in a transcript that was found at Nuremberg, I am referring to the evacuation of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish people. He said, among ourselves, it should be mentioned quite frankly, and yet we will never speak of it publicly. He spoke of the decision to kill women and children alongside men, describing the reasoning in terms of the same logic that had animated his agricultural approach to human breeding, that leaving women and children alive to grow up as avengers would be what he described as cowardly. He said, this is a page of glory in our history which has never been written and is never to be written. These are not reconstructed paraphrases. They are recorded words. The tapes were discovered after the war. The Nuremberg tribunal heard them. The historiographical significance of the Posen speeches is considerable and the subject of genuine academic debate. Some historians, particularly those working in the tradition of what is called intentionalism, arguing that the Holocaust was the product of Hitler's and Himmler's long-held and explicit ideological intentions, cite Posen as evidence that the leadership was fully conscious of what it was doing from the beginning and needed no euphemistic cover for itself in internal communication. Others, working from what is called a functionalist or structuralist perspective, note that the explicit language of Posen was itself situational, deployed in a specific context to a specific audience for specific rhetorical purposes, and that the habitual use of euphemism in written documentation reflects a genuine awareness within the regime that what it was doing was legally and morally extraordinary and needed to be protected from subsequent legal accountability. Both interpretations contain important truth, and neither fully explains Himmler's specific choice to speak as he did at Posen. The audience, senior SS and military commanders, were not people who needed to be informed. They knew. The purpose of the speech, in the reading of most modern historians, was not informational, but binding. Himmler was explicitly making his audience complicit, on the record, in a shared historical crime from which none of them could later claim distance. By speaking the unspeakable clearly and plainly, and by framing what had been done as a historical achievement demanding silence rather than a crime requiring denial, he was creating a community of shared guilt that had no exit. It was, in a sense, the ultimate administrative act, a binding resolution that all parties had signed by virtue of their presence and their silence. The military context of October 1943 is significant. The German front on the Eastern Front had stabilized, but only after a series of significant defeats that had, in the assessment of any honest senior German officer, fundamentally altered the trajectory of the war. The catastrophe at Stalingrad in February, the failure at Kursk in July, the Allied invasion of Sicily in the same month, and of mainland Italy in September. By October of 1943, a clear-eyed assessment of Germany's strategic position was not encouraging. The people in that room in Posen knew, at some level, that the war might not be won. Himmler's decision to speak openly in that context has been interpreted by several historians as partly a response to that awareness, an effort to ensure that the men who controlled Germany's military and security apparatus were fully committed, with no possibility of retreat or moral reservation, to the continuation of the killing programs, regardless of how the military situation developed. The 6th of October speech was addressed not to SS officers alone, but to a group of Reichsleiter and Gauleiter, the senior political leadership of the Nazi Party, the men who ran the administrative districts of the Reich itself. This second audience is significant because it extended the explicit acknowledgement well beyond the security apparatus into the civilian party hierarchy. These were not soldiers or police officers. They were politicians and administrators. Their presence at Posen, listening to Himmler's explicit description of what had been done, and their subsequent continued service in their positions, represents an additional dimension of the complicity that Himmler was, in effect, manufacturing and documenting in October of 1943. In the weeks and months following Posen, Himmler gave additional speeches to various military and party audiences in which he returned to the same themes, always in the same oral, undeniable but unwritten form. He spoke to army generals in Sonderfen in May of 1944. He spoke to naval officers. He addressed Hitler Youth leadership. The pattern of these speeches, explicit acknowledgement of the killings, framed as historical necessity and collective responsibility, suggests a deliberate communication strategy rather than occasional candor. Himmler was, in a very real sense, inoculating the senior leadership of Germany against any future claim of ignorance. The post-war legal implications of that strategy were, given the way the war ended, not what he intended. 1943 also saw the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the most significant instance of armed resistance by Jewish people during the entire period of the Holocaust. Beginning on the 19th of April 1943, the eve of Passover, a Jewish fighting organization of several hundred fighters, armed with a small number of weapons, smuggled into the ghetto at enormous personal risk over the preceding months, resisted the final German liquidation operation. The uprising lasted approximately 4 weeks, far longer than anyone, including the German commander SS Gruppenführer Jürgen Stroop, had anticipated. Stroop's own report, titled "The Jewish Quarter of Warsaw No Longer Exists," submitted to Himmler in a bound, leather-covered edition, documents the operation in the same clinical administrative language that characterized all SS reporting, alongside photographs. The document was submitted as evidence at Nuremberg. Stroop was later executed for war crimes. Himmler's response to the uprising was, characteristically, administrative. He ordered the complete destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. He also ordered a review of security arrangements at ghettos and camps across occupied Poland, seeking to ensure that resistance could be preempted through earlier and more thorough disarmament of inmates. The uprising had no military consequences for the German occupation. It was suppressed with overwhelming force, but its psychological and historical consequences are considerable. And Himmler appears to have understood that, because the thoroughness of his response, the destruction not just of the ghetto's remaining population, but of the physical buildings themselves, exceeded any purely military requirement. By the close of 1943, more than 3 million Jewish people had been killed in the Holocaust, approximately half of the final total. The pace of killing had accelerated through the year. The infrastructure of death camps, transport networks, and bureaucratic coordination was operating at maximum efficiency. Himmler was managing the empire that had killed them with the same steady administrative precision he had brought to the SS marriage decree in 1931. Across the continent, in countries from France to Greece to Hungary, families were being recorded on lists compiled by local officers of the Russia, awaiting transport east. The machine was running, and at the center of the machine was a man who had just delivered in a public speech, the most explicit acknowledgement of mass murder ever made by a senior figure of a major state, and who had then returned to his desk, adjusted his glasses, and continued to manage his correspondence. Chapter 10. The cracks begin. The July Plot, Himmler's Peak Power, and the Collapse of Germany, 1944. The 20th of July, 1944 is one of the most analysed days in the history of the Second World War. In the early afternoon, a bomb planted by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg detonated in Hitler's forward headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Hitler survived, wounded, his uniform partly destroyed, his right arm temporarily impaired, his eardrums damaged by the blast. The bomb had killed 4 people in the room, but had not killed the man it was designed to kill. The reasons for Hitler's survival: the table that redirected the blast, the heavy wooden table leg that absorbed much of the force, the open windows that dissipated the pressure, have been analysed extensively and are documented in detail by multiple witnesses and subsequent forensic examination. What matters for the Himmler story is what happened in the hours that followed. The conspirators, a network of military officers, civil servants, and politicians who had been planning the coup for months under the code name Operation Valkyrie, briefly believed the assassination had succeeded and began activating the takeover plan in Berlin. The signal failure of the plot was the absence of certain confirmation of Hitler's death, and within that window of uncertainty, Himmler acted. He was appointed commander of the reserve army, the Ersatzheer, by Hitler within hours of the bomb's detonation. He was already on his way to Berlin when the coup collapsed. The arrests that followed, including the execution of Stauffenberg and 3 fellow conspirators in the early hours of the 21st of July, were coordinated under his authority. In the weeks that followed the failed coup, Himmler's power reached its absolute peak. The investigation into the conspiracy, which eventually implicated hundreds of individuals and led to the deaths of a significant number of German military officers, including Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who was hanged at Plötzensee prison in Berlin in August of 1944, was conducted by the RSA under Himmler's direction. The army's internal investigation was progressively taken over by the SS. Himmler was appointed to command the replacement army, which gave him direct authority over the training and organization of new German military formations for the first time. In September of 1944, he was given command of Army Group Upper Rhine. In January of 1945, he was given command of Army Group Vistula on the Eastern Front. These military appointments were, by any objective assessment, a significant error of judgment, and there is a genuine historiographical question about whether Hitler made them with a clear understanding of Himmler's limitations as a field commander, or whether they represent a failure of judgment on Hitler's part, driven by the dwindling pool of trusted military talent following the purge of officers involved in the July Plot. Himmler had no military training beyond his brief and incomplete experience as an officer candidate in 1917 and 1918. He had never commanded troops in the field. He had managed the Waffen-SS as an institutional sponsor and political patron, not as a field commander. The move to appoint him to actual Army Group command proved, as historians universally agree, disastrous. His performance at Army Group Vistula in the winter of 1944 to 1945 was described by Wehrmacht generals on his own staff in terms that ranged from dismissive to contemptuous. Meanwhile, in the summer and autumn of 1944, the killing programs reached their quantitative peak. The deportation of Hungarian Jews, delayed by the German occupation of Hungary in March of 1944, which Himmler had organized and partially directed, produced the largest single influx to Auschwitz-Birkenau in the camp's history. Between May and July of 1944, The number of Hungarian Jewish people killed at Auschwitz was more than 400,000 in approximately 8 weeks. The gas chambers and crematoria were operating beyond their designed capacity. Adolf Eichmann, whose office in the Risha had been responsible for organizing the deportation logistics, was in Budapest personally supervising the transportation arrangements. Himmler was aware of the operations in real time through the regular reporting system. It is in this period, the summer of 1944, that the first clear evidence emerges of Himmler beginning to seek a way out. The evidence is indirect and requires our careful handling, because Himmler was not a man who committed his strategic hedging to writing, but through Felix Kirsten's memoirs, which are a complicated source, disputed in some details, but accepted in their broad outlines by most serious historians, and through the documented contacts that Swiss intermediaries made on behalf of Himmler from mid-1944 onward. It is clear that Himmler was, at some level, exploring whether the Western Allies might be willing to negotiate with him as a representative of a post-Hitler Germany. The logic, such as it was, rested on a calculation that the Western Allies feared Soviet expansion in Europe enough to prefer a negotiated settlement with a German interlocutor over the complete destruction of the German state. This calculation was entirely delusional, and there is evidence that people around Himmler knew it was delusional. The Allies had committed publicly to unconditional surrender at Casablanca in January of 1943. They had demonstrated no willingness to negotiate, and the idea that the man who had organized the Holocaust, whose name was known in the Allied capitals as the chief architect of the systematic murder of millions, would be accepted as a peace interlocutor was, to any analyst with access to Allied communications, a fantasy. But Himmler pursued it anyway, through a series of back-channel contacts that included meetings with World Jewish Congress representative Norbert Masur in April of 1945. A meeting at which, extraordinarily, he released a small number of Jewish concentration camp inmates as a gesture of goodwill. The contradiction between that gesture and the ongoing killing at the camps, which Himmler had not yet formally ordered halted, represents what is, historically, one of the more grotesque ironies of the final phase of the war. Himmler was simultaneously ordering the destruction of evidence at the camps, approving the death marches that killed thousands of inmates being moved west ahead of Soviet advances, making overtures to Allied representatives through intermediaries, and sitting in increasingly irrelevant military command posts, reviewing battle reports he lacked the expertise to interpret. The man who had spent more than 2 decades building systems was watching every system he had built collapse simultaneously. The liberation of the first major concentration camps by Allied forces in the spring of 1945. Majdanek, liberated by Soviet forces in the summer of 1944, then Auschwitz in January of 1945, then Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau by American and British forces in April, brought the reality of the Holocausts to Western public consciousness in a way that no preceding intelligence report or diplomatic communication had achieved. The images and footage from Bergen-Belsen, where British forces found tens of thousands of surviving inmates in conditions of catastrophic starvation alongside tens of thousands of unburied dead, were broadcast in British cinemas and American newsreels. Members of Parliament visited in person. The American journalist, Edward R. Murrow, broadcast his report from Buchenwald in language whose controlled fury has never been surpassed. In Berlin, as Soviet forces encircled the city in April of 1945, Adolf Hitler learned through a foreign press broadcast that Himmler had been in contact with Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden, a Red Cross official and Swedish nobleman, and had proposed, through Bernadotte, to surrender German forces on the Western Front to the Western Allies. while continuing to fight in the East. Hitler's response, when this news reached him in the bunker on the 27th of April, 1945, was one of the deepest personal betrayals of his life. He stripped Himmler of all offices, expelled him from the Nazi Party, and ordered his arrest. The most loyal man in the Third Reich, the man who had never wavered, never questioned, never attempted to build a separate accommodation with political reality, had, in the end, attempted exactly that. Hitler died by suicide 2 days later. Himmler was already in disguise on the roads of northern Germany, heading nowhere in particular, with a vial of cyanide in his mouth. Chapter 11, The Man in Disguise, Flight, Capture, and the Final Act, April to May 1945. The Germany through which Heinrich Himmler travelled in the final days of April and the first weeks of May 1945 was not a country anymore in any functional sense. The institutions he had built, the police, the SS, the concentration camp system, the security apparatus, were dissolving. Officers were discarding their uniforms and attempting to melt into civilian populations. The roads of northern Germany were clogged with millions of displaced people, German civilians fleeing Soviet advances from the east, concentration camp inmates being marched west by guards, who were no longer certain why they were marching anyone anywhere, Wehrmacht soldiers moving in improvised columns that no longer had meaningful command structures, Allied prisoners of war walking in the opposite direction. The Third Reich had not so much surrendered as evaporated. Himmler had prepared, with characteristic thoroughness, for the possibility that he might need to disappear. He had a set of identity documents prepared in a false name. He chose the identity of Heinrich Himmler, a sergeant in the secret field police, one of the less prominent SS-affiliated organizations whose members were not automatically subject to automatic arrest by Allied forces. He shaved his small mustache. He covered one eye with a patch. He shed the Reichsfuhrer SS uniform that he had worn for 16 years and put on a nondescript military coat. He carried, as he always had, his organizational instincts. He had a small group of aides with him, the remnant of the personal staff that had been managing his appointments and correspondence since the 1930s. The collapse of organized German resistance in northern Germany came rapidly in the first weeks of May 1945. German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands surrendered to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery on the 4th of May. The overall German instrument of surrender was signed at Reims in France on the 7th of May and ratified in Berlin on the 8th. On that day, Victory in Europe Day, Himmler was moving through the collapsed landscape of northern Germany with his small group of companions, heading generally south, without a clear destination and without any realistic prospect of the outcome he had been attempting to engineer through his contacts with Bernadotte and through Kirsten. He was, in these final days, still making decisions with the instinct of a man who believed that the right organizational arrangement could produce an acceptable outcome from any situation. He sent emissaries. He drafted communications. He attempted, through whatever channels still existed, to position himself as a representative of a successor German government that might negotiate acceptable terms with the Western Allies. None of it produced any result. The Allied position on Himmler was unambiguous. He was on every war crimes list, in every intelligence assessment, identified as one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, and one of the most culpable individuals in the German state. There was no scenario in which the Allies were going to negotiate with him. The emissaries he sent out returned with nothing. The channels produced no response. He was captured at a British checkpoint near Bremerverde in Lower Saxony on the 21st of May, 1945. The disguise had not worked as intended. The soldiers at the checkpoint were conducting a systematic check of all travellers, and the papers of Heinrich Himmler were examined. He was detained not because he was immediately identified, but because a sergeant in the field police, traveling with a group of men in civilian clothes in the immediate aftermath of the German surrender, attracted routine scrutiny. He was taken to a detention facility at Barfeld, where the process of processing the vast number of German prisoners being captured in these days was proceeding through an understaffed and improvised administrative apparatus. He revealed his identity himself. The reasons for this decision have been analyzed by historians who are divided on the question of what Himmler expected to follow from it. Some argue that he believed he could still negotiate, that by declaring himself, he was offering the British something of intelligence value, significant enough to warrant special treatment. Others argue that the disguise had become untenable, and that he revealed himself because continued pretense was impossible. His biographer Peter Longerich suggests that both elements were present, and that Himmler retained, even in custody, a fundamental conviction that his own importance to any post-war reconstruction of Europe gave him a leverage he no longer possessed. He was transferred to the headquarters of 2nd British Army at Lüneburg for interrogation. He was examined by a British Army doctor, Captain C.J. Wells, and during the examination, before it could be established whether he had concealed any item on his person, he bit down on a cyanide capsule that had been hidden in a cavity in his lower jaw. The capsule ruptured. He was dead within 12 minutes. The date was the 23rd of May, 1945. He was 44 years old. He had been Reichsführer SS for 16 years, 4 months, and 22 days. The British response to his death was, in the historical record, largely practical. The death of such a significant war crimes suspect, before formal legal proceedings had been completed, was a significant intelligence and legal setback. The interrogations that might have mapped the chain of command for the Holocaust, with greater precision than the documentary record alone could achieve, were foreclosed. The question of what, specifically, Himmler knew and when he knew it, which is, as historians acknowledge, already quite well established from the documentary evidence, might have been clarified further by sustained interrogation. His death foreclosed that possibility. He was buried in an unmarked grave near Lüneburg. The location was not disclosed, and it remained undisclosed for many decades, specifically to prevent it from becoming a site of neo-Nazi commemoration. The physical evidence that remained after Himmler was the organizational record he had spent his career generating. The files of the Recha, the reports of the Einsatzgruppen, the camp records of Auschwitz and the other facilities, the transport documentation of the Reich Railway, the correspondence of the Race and Settlement Office, the conference minutes of the Wannsee meeting, the recording of the Posen speeches. This mountain of administrative documentation, partially destroyed but never fully eradicated, formed the evidentiary basis for the Nuremberg trials and for the decades of historical scholarship that followed. Himmler had been, above all things, a bureaucrat. His bureaucracies outlasted him. Its records testified against the system he had built with a precision and completeness that none of his subordinates, facing the Nuremberg prosecutors, could escape. The Nuremberg military tribunals, beginning in November of 1945, drew on the institutional record that Himmler had created. 12 of the 24 defendants at the main Nuremberg trial were convicted. Several were sentenced to death. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Heydrich's successor as head of the Recha, was hanged on the 16th of October, 1946. Oswald Pohl, head of the WW and administrator of the concentration camp Economic Empire, was tried separately, convicted, and executed in 1951. The trials established the principle of individual criminal accountability for state-organized atrocity in international law, a principle that had not existed in codified form before Nuremberg, and that Himmler's institutional legacy made unavoidable as a legal necessity. The legacy of what Himmler built outlasted the trials, outlasted the executions, outlasted the physical dismantling of the SS apparatus. It outlasted in the most important sense, the sense of what it required subsequent generations to understand about how such a system is built, and what conditions must exist for a bureaucracy to become an instrument of mass murder. That question, asked by Hannah Arendt, by Raoul Hilberg, by Christopher Browning, by Peter Longerich, by Saul Friedlander, and dozens of other historians whose work has extended across the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st, is the reason this documentary is possible and the reason this documentary is necessary. Chapter 12. The Historian's Himmler. Memory, Scholarship, and What Remains, 1945 to the Present. The historiography of Heinrich Himmler, the academic literature that has attempted to understand, document, and explain his life and his crimes, is itself a significant body of historical work, spanning more than 70 years and multiple national scholarly traditions. It is worth examining, not as an exercise in academic meta-commentary, but because the questions that historians have asked about Himmler, and the debates they have conducted about those questions, reveal something important about how humanity has processed the evidence of the Holocaust and what remains genuinely unresolved. The earliest serious historical work on Himmler and the SS emerged in the immediate post-war years, primarily from the evidence assembled for the Nuremberg trials. Raoul Hilberg's monumental work, The Destruction of the European Jews, first published in 1961, provided the first systematic, document-based account of the administrative machinery through which the Holocaust was carried out. Hilberg's focus was less on individual psychology than on institutional process, on how precisely a modern bureaucratic state organized and executed the killing of 6 million people. His answer, which remains the scholarly foundation of Holocaust studies, emphasized the role of bureaucratic structure, functional specialization, and the normalization of extraordinary orders through regular administrative channels. Himmler appears throughout Hilberg's analysis as the central institutional figure, the man who controlled more of the machinery than any other individual. The intentionalist-functionalist debate, which dominated Holocaust historiography from roughly the 1970s through the 1990s, centered on the question of whether the Holocaust was the product of a long-held, explicitly planned intention originating with Hitler and Himmler before the war, or whether it emerged from the chaotic, polycratic structure of the Nazi regime, accelerating in response to military circumstances and bureaucratic competition among rival agencies. Richard Breitman's 1991 study, The Architect of Genocide, argued on the basis of new documentary evidence that Himmler had developed his plan for the murder of Soviet Jews before the invasion of the Soviet Union, before June of 1941, and that the decisions were more deliberate and more anticipated than the functionalist school allowed. Peter Longerich's comprehensive biography, published in German in 2008 and in English translation in 2012, is the most thorough single-author account of Himmler's life and remains the scholarly standard. The question of motivation, why Himmler believed what he believed and did what he did, has generated a separate strand of inquiry. The traditional explanatory frameworks that dominated the immediate post-war period, the idea that the perpetrators were essentially abnormal, that the crimes they committed required pathological psychology, have been significantly revised by subsequent research. Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, published in 1992, which examined the behavior of Reserve Police Battalion 101 in occupied Poland, demonstrated that ordinary middle-aged men without prior criminal history, without the ideological formation that characterized SS officers, participated in mass killings without coercion when ordered to do so. That finding, which provoked a significant scholarly controversy with Daniel Goldhagen's competing argument in Hitler's Willing Executioners, has not been overturned, though the debate about the relative weight of ideology versus situational compliance continues in the scholarship. Himmler's specific psychology, the question of what kind of mind can organize genocide, has attracted researchers across disciplines. What emerges from the most serious psychological analyses, working from the documentary record rather than clinical speculation, is a portrait of a man who was not, by conventional psychiatric measurement, insane or even severely disordered. He was rigid. He was obsessive. He had a remarkable capacity for compartmentalization, and he was possessed of an ideological commitment that functioned, in his cognitive architecture, as a complete explanatory framework for all human experience. What he did not have, as best the historical record can determine, was any sustained capacity for moral empathy with the people his systems killed. His occasional expressions of concern for his SS men's psychological welfare, for what he described as the heavy burden of their historical duty, were entirely inward-facing. The victims do not appear in his moral accounting at all. That absence is the most significant psychological finding in the record. The physical evidence of Himmler's empire, the camps themselves, the preserved documentation, the mass graves across Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, has been the subject of ongoing forensic and archaeological investigation for decades, and research continues today. The Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, which opened in 1947 and which now receives more than 2 million visitors per year, preserves the physical remains of the camp as a site of documentation and memory. The Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial and Research Center in Jerusalem, established by Israeli law in 1953, holds one of the world's most comprehensive collections of documentary evidence relating to the Holocaust, including extensive records of the SS administrative apparatus that organized it. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., which opened in 1993, provides public access to research materials and survivor testimony that collectively represent one of the most thoroughly documented historical atrocities ever committed. The survivors, the men, women, and children who lived through the camps, the ghettos, the hiding, the flight, gave testimony that began immediately after liberation and continued in organized programs of documentation for decades. The Shoah Foundation, founded by Steven Spielberg following the production of Schindler's List in 1993, collected and archived more than 55,000 video testimonies in 32 languages across 56 countries. These testimonies, which complement and in important ways exceed what the institutional documentary record can provide, give the bureaucratic history its human dimension. Himmler's organizational chart becomes, in survivor testimony, a list of specific decisions that ended specific lives. The transport document becomes the last journey. The selection record becomes a family separation. The administrative language that Himmler cultivated throughout his career as a screen between the machinery and its consequences is, in survivor testimony, removed. The legal legacy of the Nuremberg trials and of the continuing prosecutions that followed, including the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, and the decades-long German prosecution program that resulted in convictions as recently as the 21st century, established a body of international criminal law that drew directly from the specific institutional arrangements of Himmler's SS. The concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide, as codified in international law, after Nuremberg, were shaped by the specific historical evidence of what the SS had done. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which entered into force in 2002, is a direct institutional descendant of the principles that Nuremberg established in response to Himmler's apparatus. The cultural memory of Himmler, his place in the public imagination, as opposed to the scholarly record, is a more complicated matter. He has appeared as a character in dozens of films, novels, and dramatic works, and the quality of these representations varies enormously. The tendency in popular culture to represent him either as a cartoonish villain or as an inscrutable monster, to resolve the difficulty of his ordinariness by emphasizing his surface abnormality, is, from a historical standpoint, a distortion that serves psychological comfort more than historical understanding. The discomfort that the genuine historical record produces, the recognition that he was, in the specific sense of his daily behavior and his institutional methods, comprehensibly human, is precisely the discomfort that the historical record demands we do not resolve. The neo-Nazi movements that have sought to appropriate SS symbolism, the skull insignia, the runes, the organizational aesthetic that Himmler deliberately designed to communicate racial hierarchy and quasi-mystical authority, represent a specific and ongoing challenge for law enforcement, for historians, and for the communities most directly descended from the Holocaust victims. In Germany, the display of SS insignia is illegal under criminal statute. In other countries, the legal frameworks vary. The symbolic power of the aesthetic Himmler created persists across 8 decades, precisely because it was designed to persist, designed to communicate, with visual shorthand, a complete ideological claim about human hierarchy. Countering that visual language requires understanding where it came from and what institutional purpose it served. What remains in the end, when the last chapter of Himmler's biography is closed, is a specific kind of historical lesson. It is not the lesson that evil is mysterious. It is not the lesson that evil requires madness or abnormality or some quality that sets the perpetrator fundamentally apart from ordinary humanity. The lesson that Himmler's history teaches, the lesson that the scholars who have worked with his documentation for 70 years consistently return to, is that the organized, bureaucratically systematic destruction of human life requires the same basic institutional elements as any other organized enterprise. A clear objective, a chain of command, adequate resources, reliable personnel, effective coordination between agencies, and a leadership willing to enforce accountability for results. Every one of those elements was present in the SS. Every one of those elements can exist, in theory, in any institutional context in which ideology has displaced ethics from the center of organizational decision-making. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It was never meant to be. History, when it is done properly, is rarely comfortable, and it was never, in the tradition of the historians who have spent their careers with this material, supposed to be. The discomfort is the point. The discomfort is what makes remembering worth the effort. If you have stayed with this documentary through these 12 chapters, through the chicken farm in Bavaria, the SS marriage decree, the Einsatzgruppen reports, the Posen speeches, and the unmarked grave near Lüneburg, then you understand something about this history that a summary cannot convey. This is the kind of story that needs time. It needs the full weight of accumulated evidence before the scale of it becomes real. If this documentary has been valuable to you, if it has given you something to think about, something to discuss, something to share, please consider subscribing to this channel. Leave a comment below with one thing from these chapters that you want to know more about. We will be continuing this documentary through the final 3 chapters in our next release, covering the legacy of the SS, the Nuremberg prosecutions in full, and the long post-war reckoning with Himmler's institutional inheritance. That release is coming soon. Do not miss it. Chapter 13. Nuremberg and the Reckoning, Prosecuting the SS Empire, 1945 to 1949. when the International Military Tribunal convened at Nuremberg on the 20th of November, 1945, it was doing something that had never been done before in the history of organized states. It was attempting to hold the senior leadership of a government criminally accountable as individuals for decisions made in the exercise of official authority. The legal framework was improvised, the precedents were thin, and the defendants' lawyers argued from the first day that the tribunal was applying law retroactively to acts that were either legal under German law at the time they were committed or were, in the case of the crimes themselves, not legally defined as international crimes before the London Charter of August 1945 created that definition. These were not frivolous objections. They were serious legal arguments, and the tribunal's responses to them, preserved in the judgment and in the proceedings, established principles that remain contested in international law to this day. But the proceedings went forward, and the primary evidence that they drew upon, the documentary record of the SS, the concentration camp system, and the Einsatzgruppen, was Himmler's institutional legacy in its most direct form. 24 defendants were indicted at the main Nuremberg trial. Himmler was not among them because he was dead. His absence was a significant gap in the proceedings, acknowledged by the prosecution, because no single surviving defendant had commanded the same breadth of the criminal apparatus. Hermann Göring, who had signed the authorizations for Heydrich to develop the final solution, and had been Himmler's occasional bureaucratic rival for police authority in Prussia, was the most prominent defendant, and conducted himself with a theatrical combativeness that dominated the early weeks of the trial. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Heydrich's successor as head of the Russia, denied knowledge of the killing operations with a persistence that the documentary evidence demolished repeatedly and publicly. Wilhelm Frick, the interior minister, whose nominal authority over the police had been progressively hollowed out by Himmler's institutional expansion, argued that he had been a figurehead without real power, an argument that the tribunal found partially credible in its assessment of his specific culpability, but ultimately insufficient to acquit him of crimes against humanity. He was convicted and hanged on the 16th of October, 1946. The prosecution's case at Nuremberg relied on a volume and quality of documentary evidence that no prior war crimes proceeding had possessed. The SS's own institutional habit of meticulous record-keeping, the administrative culture that Himmler had instilled from the earliest days of his command, provided the prosecution with a documentary archive that was, in the words of the chief American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, essentially self-prosecuting. Einsatzgruppen event reports, the Wannsee conference minutes, the camp mortality statistics, the transport manifests of the Reich Railway, Himmler's own correspondence and directives, the Posen speech recordings. These were not evidence assembled by investigators after the fact. They were the institutional records of a government that had documented its own crimes in the ordinary course of administration. The SS had killed millions and filed the paperwork. The paperwork survived. This inversion of the normal relationship between perpetrator and documentation, in which the perpetrators had generated the prosecution's most damning evidence, was a direct consequence of the administrative culture that Himmler had built, and the organizational perfectionism that had defined his career from the first months of his command. The tribunal also addressed, in a decision that had lasting consequences for international law, the criminal status of the SS as an organization. The prosecution had asked the tribunal to declare the SS, along with the Gestapo, the SD, and the leadership corps of the Nazi Party, a criminal organization, a finding that would have allowed the subsequent prosecution of individual SS members without requiring proof of specific criminal acts by each individual. The tribunal granted this declaration for the SS with the specific limitation that the Waffen-SS members who had been conscripted after the war's outbreak, without genuine choice, were not automatically covered. This distinction between the ideological volunteer SS and the conscripted combat soldier was, and remains, legally and historically contested. It allowed a significant number of Waffen-SS veterans to avoid automatic prosecution and eventually to seek veterans' benefits in West Germany, a political and legal outcome that generated substantial controversy in subsequent decades. The 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, conducted by American military tribunals after the main Nuremberg proceedings, ended in October of 1946, address specific components of the SS empire in detail that the main trial could not achieve. The doctor's trial, which concluded in August of 1947, resulted in the conviction of 7 defendants for the medical experiments conducted in the concentration camps and produced the Nuremberg Code, the foundational document of modern research ethics, which established the principles of voluntary consent and the prohibition on experiments likely to cause death or disabling injury. The Einsatzgruppen trial, which concluded in April of 1948, convicted all 22 defendants of crimes against humanity, with 14 receiving death sentences, of whom 4 were eventually executed. The WW2 trial convicted Oswald Pohl and other senior administrators of the camp economic system. The Russia trial, addressing the Race and Settlement Main Office, convicted defendants of crimes related to the abduction of children from occupied territories for Germanization, the forced sterilization programs, and the management of the resettlement operations in occupied Poland. Each trial was, in effect, an institutional audit of one component of the system that Himmler had built, and each produced a documentary record that has served historical scholarship ever since. The West German government, established in 1949, inherited the legal obligation to continue prosecutions of Nazi war criminals under German law, and the record of those prosecutions over the following 7 decades is lengthy, uneven, and a significant chapter in the history of legal accountability. The Central Office of the State Justice Administrations for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, established in Ludwigsburg in 1958, served as the coordinating agency for German federal and state prosecutors pursuing Nazi war crimes cases. It identified more than 100,000 suspects in its first decade of operation. The number of convictions achieved relative to that number of suspects was, by any measure, small. A product of the legal standard of proof required under German criminal law, the age and death of witnesses, the destruction of evidence, and, in the view of many historians, an insufficient degree of prosecutorial commitment in the early decades of the Federal Republic, when former Nazis occupied significant positions in the government, judiciary, and military. The legal reckoning was real but partial, and its partiality is itself a historical fact that requires acknowledgement. The Adolf Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961 stands apart from the Nuremberg proceedings and the West German domestic prosecutions as a unique event in the legal history of the Holocaust. Eichmann, head of the Ehrrecher's Jewish Affairs Office, and the man most directly responsible for the logistical coordination of the deportation transports, had escaped to Argentina in 1950, using a false identity provided through networks that connected former SS men, certain sympathetic Catholic clergy, and various refugee organizations that had been exploited or deceived. He was living under the name Ricardo Clement in Buenos Aires when Israeli intelligence agents abducted him in May of 1960. He was brought to Israel, tried publicly under Israeli law, convicted, and hanged on the 1st of June, 1962. The trial was televised and widely followed. Hannah Arendt covered it for The New Yorker, and her subsequent book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, with its analysis of what she called the banality of evil, generated a debate that has not concluded in the 60-plus years since its publication. The question of whether Eichmann was a bureaucratic functionary who had suspended his moral judgment in service of institutional compliance, or a committed ideological anti-Semite who embraced his work with genuine fervor, remains contested. With the balance of recent scholarship, particularly Bettina Stangneth's research into Eichmann's private writings and recorded conversations in Argentina, tilting toward the latter conclusion. The post-war legal proceedings produced a body of jurisprudence, but they also produced something whose historical importance may ultimately be greater: a consolidated documentary record of institutional criminality that could not be suppressed or rewritten. Every court transcript, every exhibit entered into evidence, every judgment handed down represented another layer of verified historical documentation added to the record that Himmler's own organizational perfectionism had begun. The irony is exact and total. The man who built his career on meticulous documentation, who created the institutional culture of detailed record keeping that characterized the SS at every level of operation, provided through that culture the primary evidentiary basis for the legal dismantling of his legacy. His administrative habits outlasted him in the most consequential possible way. The physical sites of the Holocaust, the former camps, the mass graves, the former ghettos, became sites of legal, historical, and moral contestation in the decades after the war. In Poland, where the largest camp complexes were located, the post-war communist government conducted its own investigations and prosecutions, with mixed results, and, in some cases, with political distortions that reflected the regime's own ideological interests, rather than historical accuracy. The Auschwitz-Birkenau complex was preserved and established as a museum, though the management of its historical representation was subject to political pressures throughout the communist period. The Polish historical understanding of Auschwitz, which initially emphasized Polish Catholic victims over Jewish victims in ways that reflected both genuine history and a problematic hierarchy of victimhood, evolved significantly through the 1980s and 90s, influenced by dialogue with Jewish communities, by the work of the Polish Jewish intellectual Władysław Bartoszewski, and by the broader global shift in understanding of the Holocaust that characterized the final decades of the 20th century, the legal proceedings that continued into the 21st century. The prosecution of John Demjanjuk in Germany in 2011, the conviction of Oskar Groening in 2015 for his role as an SS bookkeeper at Auschwitz who processed the currency confiscated from arriving prisoners, and the prosecution of former SS guard Bruno Day in 2019 at the age of 93, established a principle that had not been fully operational in the earlier decades of German prosecution: that participation in the administrative functioning of the killing machinery, even without specific proof of individual killing acts, constituted accessory to murder under German law. This legal evolution, achieved decades after the primary perpetrators had died of old age, was both a vindication of the documentary record and an acknowledgement of how long it had taken the German legal system to fully confront the institutional scope of what the SS had done. The survivors who had waited for that acknowledgement had, in too many cases, waited their entire lifetimes. Chapter 14. The Long Shadow. SS Networks, Cold War Legacies, and the Incomplete Accounting, 1945 to 2000. The defeat of Germany in May of 1945 did not produce the clean institutional collapse that the formal language of surrender implied. The SS was declared an illegal criminal organization. Its surviving leadership was on trial or in prison. Its infrastructure, the camps, the police stations, the administrative offices, was dismantled, occupied, or converted to Allied military use. But the men who had comprised that infrastructure, the hundreds of thousands of SS personnel across its various branches, had not ceased to exist. They had changed their clothes, discarded their membership documents, buried their service records when they could, and begun the process of reinserting themselves into the fabric of German and European society. Understanding how many of them succeeded, and under what conditions, and with what long-term consequences for post-war Europe and beyond, is one of the more uncomfortable chapters in the historiography of the Third Reich. The escape networks that allowed former SS and Nazi officials to reach safety in South America, the Middle East, and elsewhere, known collectively by the name rat lines, a term that entered the historical literature from contemporaneous intelligence documents, were not a single organized operation, but a constellation of overlapping networks with different sponsors, different routes, and different levels of efficiency. The most significant of these was the network operated under the sponsorship of a Croatian Catholic priest, Krunoslav Draganovic, operating through the monastery of San Girolamo degli Illyrici in Rome, which provided false papers and travel documentation for former Croatian Ustašo officials, and, through connections that post-war investigators have documented, for a number of former SS officers. The International Red Cross, whose travel documents were the most widely accepted proof of identity in the immediate post-war period, issued documents to individuals whose backgrounds were not checked against war crimes lists, a failure that the organization later acknowledged. The number of former SS members who reached Argentina alone, under the government of Juan Perón, which actively facilitated the immigration of European fascists through the Argentine Immigration Bureau's Buenos Aires office, has been estimated by various researchers, but the full scope has never been precisely documented. The American and British intelligence services contributed their own complications to the post-war accounting. Operation Paperclip, the American program that recruited German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists for employment in the United States defense and space programs, is the most widely known example. But the intelligence recruitment of former SS and Gestapo personnel for anti-Soviet intelligence operations was more extensive and more morally troubling. The Central Intelligence Agency, established in 1947, inherited a number of intelligence networks in Eastern Europe that had originally been established or managed by German military intelligence, the Abwehr, or by SS intelligence structures. The continued operational use of some of these networks, and of the individuals who ran them, meant that former perpetrators of war crimes were, in some documented cases, granted operational immunity or assistance in avoiding prosecution in exchange for their intelligence cooperation. The Gehlen organization, named after former German Army intelligence chief Reinhard Gehlen, who negotiated his services and his intelligence files to American custody before the war ended, is the most extensively documented case, and the records of American intelligence cooperation with former German intelligence personnel were the subject of a 7-volume report by the National Archives and Records Administration, published in 2010, which remains the authoritative account of this aspect of the Cold War intelligence relationship. In West Germany, the reintegration of former Nazi officials into the post-war state proceeded at a pace, and to a degree that subsequent generations of Germans have found, by turns, incomprehensible and shameful. The Adenauer government, which took office in 1949 and presided over the reconstruction of West German democracy and the West German economic miracle of the 1950s, was staffed at the level of senior civil servants, lawyers, judges, and ministerial officials by a significant number of men who had held positions in the Nazi state. Hans Globka, who had written the legal commentary on the Nuremberg racial laws, and later served as a senior official in the Jewish Affairs section of the Reich Interior Ministry. Served as state secretary in the Chancellor's office under Adenauer from 1953 to 1963, a position that gave him significant administrative power in the new Federal Republic. Theodor Oberländer, who had been present with an SS-affiliated unit during the Lviv pogrom of 1941, served as Federal Minister for Expellier Affairs from 1953 to 1960. These were not obscure figures or minor officials. They were senior members of the West German government, and their backgrounds were not unknown. They were tolerated, in the assessment of most historians who have studied this period, because the political and administrative reconstruction of West Germany required the skills of people who had governed before, and because the dominant political culture of the 1950s prioritized anti-communism and economic reconstruction over retrospective accountability. The Bundeswehr, the West German Armed Forces, established in 1955 in the context of NATO's need for West German military participation against the Soviet threat, was initially staffed almost entirely by former Wehrmacht officers. Former Waffen-SS officers were, under the terms of the criminal organization finding at Nuremberg, technically ineligible for Bundeswehr service. But the application of this rule was inconsistent, and the verification of individual service records was incomplete. The personnel files of Bundeswehr officers in the early decades of the new German army have been the subject of historical investigation, and the findings of that investigation, conducted by an independent commission whose work was published in 2014, documented that a significant number of early Bundeswehr generals had SS backgrounds that had not been disclosed or examined at the time of their appointments. The report generated considerable public discussion in Germany and was described by the then defense minister as requiring an honest and difficult historical self-examination by the German military. In the former German Democratic Republic, East Germany, the handling of the Nazi past proceeded through a different political framework, but with comparably incomplete results. The East German Communist government declared itself the anti-fascist state, the inheritor not of Nazi Germany, but of the resistance tradition, a self-characterization that served ideological purposes by identifying the Socialist Unity Party's lineage with those Germans who had opposed Hitler. This framework had the effect of largely absolving East German citizens of personal accountability for participation in the Nazi regime, since the regime itself was framed as having been the product of capitalist and imperialist forces overcome by the Socialist Revolution. Former Nazis who joined the Socialist Unity Party were in many cases accepted without serious scrutiny of their wartime activities. The prosecutions that the East German government did conduct were, in several documented cases, politically motivated, directed at East German citizens whose political reliability was doubted, or used as propaganda against West German officials whom the East German government wished to discredit. The result, as East German archives opened after German reunification in 1990, was a picture of the Nazi past that was in many ways as distorted as the West German version, in different directions. The survivors of the Holocaust, the men, women, and children who had lived through the camps, the ghettos, and the hiding, often the sole surviving members of families that had been entirely destroyed, built their post-war lives in the shadow of an institutional failure of accountability that was visible and ongoing. Many settled in Israel, in the United States, and in Western Europe. Many could not speak about what they had experienced for decades, not because they had forgotten, but because the social and psychological context for that speech did not yet exist. The first sustained public acknowledgement by the German state of the Holocaust, and its specific targeting of Jewish people came not in the immediate post-war years, but in the 1960s, influenced by the Eichmann trial and by the generational change that brought younger Germans, who had no personal stake in the denial, into political and cultural prominence. The 1970s brought the first serious West German public engagement with the Holocaust through popular culture, including the American television miniseries Holocaust, broadcast in Germany in 1979, which reached more than 20 million viewers and generated an unprecedented level of public discussion that the preceding 3 decades of legal proceedings and scholarly publication had not achieved. The slow work of survivor testimony documentation, the systematic collection of accounts from those who had experienced the Holocaust directly, was driven largely by the survivors themselves and by advocacy organizations, in the recognition that with the passing of every year, the primary witnesses were fewer. The USC Shoah Foundation's Testimony Archive, the Yad Vashem Testimony Collection, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Survivor Testimony Programs, and the work of hundreds of smaller regional organizations across Europe and North America represent a collective achievement of historical preservation whose full value, as a resource for historians, educators, and the communities descended from survivors, will not be fully realized for generations. The testimonies do not merely supplement the institutional documentary record. They constitute a parallel archive of historical experience that the administrative documents, by their nature, cannot contain. Himmler's event reports recorded how many people were killed, when, and by which unit. The testimony archive records what those people were doing the morning before they died, what their children's names were, what they had been afraid of, and what they had hoped for. Both archives are necessary. Neither alone is sufficient. The post-war SS veterans organizations, particularly the HIAG, the Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members, established in West Germany in 1951, represent a specific and ongoing dimension of the SS legacy that historians have examined with considerable attention. The HIAG lobbied consistently, and with some success, for the recognition of Waffen-SS veterans as equivalent in legal status to Wehrmacht veterans, for their inclusion in state pension programs, and for the revision of the criminal organization finding at Nuremberg as it applied to Waffen-SS members. The organization published a newspaper, Wickingruf, and maintained a social network that reinforced an interpretation of Waffen-SS service as military service performed in defense of Western civilization against Soviet communism. An interpretation that, while resonating with Cold War geopolitics, required the systematic suppression of the Waffen-SS unit's extensive participation in anti-partisan operations, war crimes, and, in several units' documented histories, direct involvement in killing operations. The HIAG formally dissolved in 1992, but the social networks and the interpretive tradition it maintained did not dissolve with it. By the end of the 20th century, the incomplete accounting of the post-war decades had been partially but not fully addressed. The Swiss banks controversy of the 1990s, which involved the revelation that Swiss financial institutions had retained, for decades without acknowledgement, accounts belonging to Holocaust victims whose heirs had been unable to claim them, the negotiated settlements and the establishment of claims processes, the German government's negotiations with Holocaust survivors and their descendants, coordinated through the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany, resulted in payments to survivors and in contributions to Holocaust memorial and education programs that continued into the 21st century. The German industrial companies that had used concentration camp labor, including some of the largest corporations in the post-war West German economy, were, after extended negotiations, required to contribute to a compensation fund established in 2000 that distributed funds to former forced labourers and their heirs. The fund came more than half a century after the labour was extracted. Many of those who should have received compensation had died in the preceding decades. The settlement was described by its architects as inadequate but necessary, an acknowledgement that even incomplete accountability, late and partial, was better than none. Chapter 15. What Remains? The Lesson of the Bureaucrat and the Warning in the Archive, Present Day. In a reading room at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., a researcher can request access to microfilmed copies of the Einsatzgruppen event reports, the operational summaries, the SS mobile killing units in the Soviet Union sent back to the Air Eschaya in Berlin between 1941 and 1943. The documents are the originals, photographed before their physical deterioration could proceed further. The handwriting in some is neat and regular. The statistical tables that record numbers of people killed under various categories are organized with the precision that Himmler's institutional culture demanded. The researcher turns the pages of these reports in a temperature-controlled archive with excellent lighting, more than 80 years after they were written. And the gap between the calmness of the institutional language and the reality it describes is not something that becomes easier to process with greater familiarity. It becomes harder. That gap between the administrative form and the human substance of what was administered is, in the assessment of the historians who have spent careers with this material, the central pedagogical challenge of Holocaust education in the 21st century. The institutional record is enormously well preserved, deeply researched, and publicly accessible in ways that no comparable historical atrocity can match. The facts are not in dispute. The chain of command, while complex in its operational details, is documented from multiple directions simultaneously. By the perpetrator's own records, by the testimony of survivors, by the investigations of post-war prosecutors, and by 7 decades of historical scholarship. What is in dispute? Or rather, what is not yet resolved, because it may not be fully resolvable, is the question of how to transmit the knowledge of what happened in a way that does not permit it to recede into the comfortable abstraction of history already settled and filed. The challenge of that transmission became acute in the first decades of the 21st century for a specific demographic reason. The generation of survivors who could speak from direct experience was passing. The last survivors of the major Nazi concentration camps were, by the mid-2010s, in their 80s and 90s. By the time this documentary was produced, the surviving witness population had shrunk to a small fraction of what it had been even a decade earlier. Yad Vashem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and dozens of other institutions had invested heavily in capturing and archiving survivor testimony in formats designed to remain accessible across future technological changes, including the development of interactive digital systems that allow users to ask questions of a recorded testimony and receive contextually appropriate answers drawn from hours of archived interview material. The technology is impressive. The question of whether it can substitute for the direct human transmission of witnessed experience is one that historians and educators have not resolved, and that the passing decades will answer empirically. The historiography of Himmler and the SS has not closed. New material continues to emerge. The ongoing digitization of archival collections across Germany, Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. Collections whose full extent is still not completely catalogued, periodically produces documentary finds that refine the existing picture. The opening of Soviet archives, after the dissolution of the USA in 1991, provided access to captured German documents that the Soviet Union had held since the war's end. some of which contained operational details not available in Western archives. The declassification of intelligence records in the United States and the United Kingdom, proceeding under various freedom of information frameworks, has produced additional documentation of wartime intelligence assessments and post-war SS-related operations. Each new archival release adds to a picture that is already, by historical standards, exceptionally detailed, and adds, in some cases, specific factual information that corrects or nuances the existing scholarly consensus. The neo-Nazi and far-right movements that appropriate SS aesthetics and ideology in the 21st century do not, on the available evidence, represent a serious organizational threat comparable to the SS at its height in the 1940s. What they do represent is a persistent demonstration that the ideological content of Himmler's project, the racial hierarchy, the biological nationalism, the identification of specific groups as enemies of the dominant ethnos, the framing of violence against those groups as defensive necessity, has not been made permanently culturally inaccessible by the Holocaust. The internet, and particularly the unmoderated spaces of online communication that developed in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, provided a distribution infrastructure for this ideological content that operates faster and with less friction than the pamphlet literature of the 1920s Weimar period, through which the young Himmler assembled his worldview. The parallels are not exact. The conditions are different. The ideological content is, in its essential structure, the same. The specific question of what the history of Himmler and the SS can teach about the prevention of future atrocities is one that genocide scholars, human rights organizations, and international legal bodies have engaged with seriously and with varying degrees of optimism. The early warning systems that organizations like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide have developed, which monitor for the institutional and political conditions that historically precede mass atrocity, draw explicitly on the historical record of the Holocaust for their analytical frameworks. The conditions they identify include the political dehumanization of a target group through official rhetoric and legal discrimination, the construction of a security apparatus operating outside normal legal constraints, the use of bureaucratic language to obscure the human content of policy decisions, the co-option of professional groups, doctors, lawyers, civil servants, railway officials, into the administrative execution of discriminatory policy, and the progressive normalization of each stage of escalation through incremental implementation. Every one of these conditions was present in Germany between 1933 and 1941. Most of them developed gradually through institutional processes that were visible to contemporaries, but that generated insufficient institutional resistance to prevent their full development. There is a specific detail in Himmler's career that this documentary has not yet fully addressed, and that requires attention before the final pages of this account. It concerns the question of what he believed about what he was doing, not in the cold institutional sense of administrative purpose, but in the personal, psychological sense of self-understanding. The evidence drawn from the full range of available sources suggests that Himmler believed, with complete sincerity and without significant internal conflict, that the killing programs he administered were historically necessary, morally justified by the ideology he had absorbed in his reading years, and constitutive of a future that would vindicate his generation's sacrifice. He said this in the Posen speeches. He wrote versions of it in correspondence. He expressed it to subordinates who testified after the war. He was not a man concealing a moral reservation behind a bureaucratic screen. The bureaucratic screen was, for Himmler, the moral form itself, the orderly, documented, systematically managed execution of historical necessity was how he conceived of ethical action in the service of his ideological framework. The scholars who have studied the psychology of genocide, not as a clinical diagnosis of individual perpetrators, but as a social and institutional process, have found in this quality of Himmler's self-understanding something important about the conditions under which atrocity becomes possible. The combination of ideological certainty with administrative capability produces a specific kind of danger that neither element alone creates. Ideological certainty without organizational capacity produces martyrs and fanatics. Organizational capacity without ideological certainty produces conventional crime. The combination produces the specific horror that the SS represents in history. A system in which the organizational sophistication that produces efficiency in any institutional context is directed, with full conviction and complete professional seriousness, at the systematic destruction of human beings. Understanding that combination, not resolving it into a comfortable category of individual pathology or historical uniqueness, but actually holding its full complexity in view, is what the historians who have devoted their careers to this material consistently identify as the necessary task. The memorial sites that now stand on the locations of the former SS killing facilities are, taken together, one of the most significant physical inheritances of the 20th century. Auschwitz-Birkenau, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, receives more than 2 million visitors annually from more than 160 countries. The Dachau concentration camp memorial, located roughly 16 kilometers from the center of Munich, roughly 16 kilometers from the city where Himmler grew up and built his early career, has been a place of education and remembrance since 1965 and is visited by more than 800,000 people per year, including mandatory school visits by Bavarian students. Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. The Operation Reinhard death camps, where no significant physical infrastructure survived the German demolition efforts, are commemorated through memorials built on and around the mass graves that forensic archaeologists have mapped with increasing precision through programs conducted over recent decades. Babi Yar, the site outside Kiev, where more than 33,000 people were killed over 2 days in September of 1941, has been a site of contested memorialization for decades, shaped by the complex Soviet and post-Soviet histories of Ukraine, and by the ongoing archaeological investigation of the ravine and its surrounding area. Himmler's personal papers, the surviving diaries, correspondence, and administrative documents generated by his personal office, are distributed across multiple archives in Germany, the United States, and elsewhere. The diaries, which cover his early years before the Second World War, are held at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and at the Federal Archives in Germany, and have been the primary source for the biographical work of both Bradley, Smith, and Peter Longerich. The administrative records of the SS main offices are distributed across the German Federal Archives in Berlin and Koblenz, the Institute für Zeitgeschichte in Munich, the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and the holdings of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. No single institution holds all the surviving Himmler-related documentation, and the process of integrating materials from different archives, some of which were seized by different Allied powers and traveled different post-war institutional paths, remains ongoing. The final, inescapable fact about Heinrich Himmler is that he succeeded in his own administrative terms beyond any precedent in the history of mass violence. The institutions he built functioned as designed. The killing programs operated with a logistical efficiency that the most careful contemporary analysis confirms was genuinely remarkable by the standards of large-scale institutional coordination. The system worked, in the sense that systems can be set to work when they achieve their designated output. That fact, which must be stated directly and without qualification if this documentary is to be honest, is the most important single historical lesson that Himmler's career offers, because it refuses the comfortable conclusion that such things cannot happen, or that they require extraordinary conditions that no longer exist, or that the history of the 20th century has permanently inoculated humanity against their recurrence. The history of the 20th century did not inoculate anyone against anything. It provided evidence. What humanity does with that evidence is, in every generation, an open question. This documentary has taken the position, maintained across every chapter, that the history of Heinrich Himmler is useful precisely to the extent that it is honest, that its usefulness as a warning depends entirely on the willingness to look at what the historical record actually shows, rather than at a simplified version of it that permits a comfortable distance between the past and the present. The quiet boy from Munich, who kept a neat diary and studied agriculture and carried a flag during a failed coup, and who, 20 years later, commanded the largest organized killing operation in human history from a desk covered in administrative correspondence. That specific conjunction of the ordinary and the catastrophic is not a historical curiosity. It is the shape of the warning. It is what the archive, when read carefully and honestly and in full, consistently returns to. The filing cabinets of the Russia outlasted the Reich that filled them. They will outlast us too. The question is whether we have read them carefully enough. And that is where we leave this story. Not with a simple conclusion, not with the false comfort of resolution, but with an open archive and an open question. If you have watched all 15 chapters of this documentary, if you have stayed through the chicken farm, the marriage decrees, the Einsatzgruppen reports, Posen, the collapse, the trials, and the long reckoning of the post-war decades, you have done something that matters. You have spent hours with difficult material and have not looked away. We ask two things of you. First, share this documentary with someone who takes history seriously. The story of how institutions become instruments of atrocity is not a story that belongs only in university classrooms. It belongs wherever people are making decisions about who is in charge of what kind of power. Second, leave a comment. Tell us what stayed with you. Tell us what you want to understand better. Tell us what you will do with what you have learned. The archive is open. The question is always open. Thank you for staying to the end.